And we are live. This is Dark Journalist. What a fantastic crowd we have out there in the ideas room tonight already. Of course, tonight I am joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And Olivia, Private Eyes. They're watching you. Watching you, Private Eyes. So apparently we had these JFK committee hearings, and they took place this week, and we did get Oliver Stone in those hearings, which was good, but the hearing was largely a bust because the Congress people involved were playing politics. We're going to get into that tonight, and I'm going to give specific instructions to this Luna D-Class committee on how to get some real results out of the UFO file hearings, the JFK hearings, and the RFK hearings. And the thing is, it's going to require a major push against the Central Intelligence Agency infiltration of these committees, which is a real problem. I'm going to show how and why, and also how that committee can be used to really shake things up, not with false announcements about films that have never been seen or whatever that turn out to be a bust, or, you know, in one case, I mean, in this in particular, we had Jefferson Morley, who's a JFK researcher, who's done some good work, but he was on the committee thing, and it seemed like the arc of his statements were more about, you know, his journey, and like the story after the hearings is like, hey, JFK researcher now believes there was a conspiracy. That's not the story that you want going out. What you want is the CIA was meant to produce records, and they did, but in this case, they did not. And the JFK files were blocked. That's very important. I'll tell you why they were blocked. Well, they said so many of them came out, but the key files, the George Joannides files, which are over 44 files now, and each file containing many documents, and those documents containing many pages, we have to remember the role of Joannides. I'm going to go into Joannides tonight, and we've covered him on this program, but I'm going to show how without those files, the CIA didn't give up anything except for very thin references from Jesus Angleton back in the day, so that we know he was lying. Well, there's no big surprise. So instead of this thing being just a snapshot or a standstill from 1979, we're going to show how you can really shake the entire thing up. And finally, you can take it from the JFK assassination, prove intelligence complicity and culpability. That's crucial because that's really the aspect here. And then show how it was connected to the aerospace secrecy around the UFO file. That will shake up the entire system. And then all those CIA people who are coming in to advise you on the UFO side will run for the hills. That's important. That's key. Otherwise, the committee is just an exercise in saying, hey, we declassified some stuff. So it depends on what Luna's committee wants to do. I can give you the key here tonight about how to make that committee one of the biggest hammers for transparency we've ever seen. And I'll get into all that tonight in X Series 195, which is the JFK files blocked, and of course the UFO file hijack, the CIA, all revealed here tonight. Of course, I want to remind you tonight that we'll be taking your questions in the second half of the program. We'll go about 2 hours with you here tonight, and Miss Olivia will be putting those together before I go any further. What do you got out there?
Happy Hermit 3D says, at a minimum, the JFK files must demonstrate the history of cover-up and obfuscation by the CIA and Warren Commission.
Exactly. Well, this is the thing. What's interesting to me is if you go back to the end of the House Assassinations Committee, which took place in 1979. So how long ago is that? That's 45 years ago, okay? They concluded there was a probable conspiracy. Okay, so we already had that 45 years ago. So the Warren Commission was technically blown out. But the media protected it, and the intelligence groups promoted it, and the Justice Department didn't prosecute it. So it rolled along. And then Oliver Stone, the great filmmaker who made JFK, it was a fantastic movie which exposed Jim Garrison's prosecution of the CIA and Clay Shaw for the murder of President Kennedy. And that trial took place in 1969. It was crucial to put that on the record because they had tried to whitewash Garrison out of the files, but he was the New Orleans DA who knew something was up. But he left us a very interesting Easter egg after the fact, which goes beyond the Central Intelligence Agency directly to the aerospace intelligence wing, which is a crucial aspect. And I'm going to show how the X-Protect group that we talk about so much in this program is so deeply, deeply involved, and that you can't investigate one to get real answers without investigating the other. So that's crucial. But then you got all those 90s things, which got the law on board, which said in 25 years you need to release these records. And that was for 2017. Some of the records came out. Some of them were blocked by CIA Director Pompeo. And there was a weird thing there because there were inside stories that Trump had seen something in those files that was absolutely devastating. And several now individuals that were close to him said this. And so when we look at the records that have come out, and I've perused quite a few of them, as have many JFK researchers, they show conclusively the CIA's role in setting up Oswald, but they don't have that piece that President Trump was referring to. Now, as I mentioned, the records that were blocked in this case are the Joannides files. Those could be the files that he was referring to. And those 44 files were blocked because they weren't in the original scope of the law when it was set in 1992, because nobody knew that Joannides existed. His existence and his complicity in setting up the Oswald project and all the rest took place in 2005. Now, here's the other piece that we put on the record, which is the person who gives him the Career Intelligence Medal is Bobby Inman. I'm going to show how and Inman's, the former NSA director, deputy CIA director, who's deeply involved in the UFO file, so much that in one of those later 90s disclosure efforts, he actually tells a researcher, not only do we know who is, not only do we know what the UFOs are, but we know who is inside flying them around. That's a big deal. And it is Inman, though, who gives Joannides the Career Intelligence Medal. The question is, for what? Well, Joannides had set up the ultimate psychological operation, which was Lee Harvey Oswald. But he may have done that entire piece in order to deflect from the secrecy around the UFO file. That's how you get one of those medals. Severe, heavy-duty achievement. And the fact that they kept him so secret, and he would be reenacted on a number of occasions to block genuine congressional JFK hearings in the 70s and 80s. They would roll out Joannides and say, this guy's the guy who can interface with you for the records. This is a crucial piece, and it's fine to sit there and talk about former CIA directors and all the rest of it. That's very worthy stuff, but the crucial part is, obviously there's something in the Joannides records, because those are the ones that are still being held back. I'm going to show you how to get at them, and I'm also going to show you the intense battle behind the scenes on this, and how if they're not, then it just becomes a superficial exercise where we, a journalist like Morley gets to come out and say, my journey from skeptic to believer in the CIA thing. And then he's like, oh, but I don't believe in conspiracies. Well, it's conspiratorial activity if the intelligence agencies planned to assassinate the president. So you do, even though the CIA made it a dirty word to say it's a conspiracy, that's what they engaged in. But I'm going to tell you tonight why. And why those records had been held up for 61 years, and why you still cannot see the George Joannides files, 44 of them, which were brought up to the credit of that panel. And I'm going to dissect the panel and then show tonight one of the major whistleblowers before he died, who gave us information, again, supporting that JFK had been working very closely with the UFO file. And as I've put on the record, he was assassinated over that technology, because those groups did not want him sharing that with the Russians. That was a crucial objective that they had in there. Now, I'll reveal a secret here, which we've been shooting part 2 of our miniseries dealing with Atlantis, and it's hacking Atlantis. Now, we're also shooting a documentary on all the JFK activity. You're going to have both of those coming out very soon. So we've been hitting it pretty hard. That stuff is incredible, and we're doing it with an amazing production team. So heads up, that stuff is coming out for you later this month, and watch out. Make sure you are on that newsletter list, because that's a free newsletter. It's going to let you know about all the incredible things we have coming up: documentaries, mini-series, live events, incredible X-Series episodes, interviews that will blow your mind. It's all there in the newsletter. So go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for that newsletter. Before I go any further, what do you got over there?
Alicia Holtborn wants to know, will DJ talk about the pyramids and the underground structures?
Yes, absolutely. There's a special episode coming up about that, and in part 2 of the Hacking Atlantis miniseries, we cover it extensively, including facts that are not on the ground and not available right now. So if you have the newsletter, if you're getting the newsletter, then you're going to get that before anybody, because even in social media, they take it. It comes in later, and also very often people tell me with the kind of censorship we're under, depending on what we cover now. What happens is they have to go digging around for when we're live or whatever it happens to be. So the best way to make sure that you're up to date is to make sure you're on that newsletter list. Yeah, what do you got?
Quantum Paradox says, DJ, do you think they will ever release all of the JFK files, or we better forget about it forever?
No, they won't. They're holding the crucial file, which is the Joannides file. If Joannides set up the Oswald project, if he remember, he's the top, what is his position? He's the top psychological warfare officer for the Central Intelligence Agency. He's their top guy. And he was instructed to do this in 1963, but God knows, if he's getting that career intelligence medal from Inman, who's hooked up with the UFO file, what else he was engaged in. And of course, that original block of information about JFK, and, my position is that there was a reason for JFK to be removed permanently. So, they could have done things to neuter his presidency. They could have done a number of things to knock him off track or whatever. What they needed to do was eliminate him. That's a really big deal. And Professor Scott called it the first deep state revolt against the White House. Because you see, doing all the executive action to foreign leaders or getting rid of people who are disturbing in your own government is one thing. But to remove the chief executive is a massive operation, on the inside. And that means that Kennedy was pulling the kinds of strings of power that was really a major challenge to that secret state, the deep state. And I have to say, when we get into the JFK assassination, I know it's this great trend to try to blame some state actor for it. And I've seen this for years anyway, but it changes, the state changes in this case. The CIA has always pushed Russia, Cuba. We hear all about it. Israel. I even heard Iran. Well, what you have to understand is the deep state assassinated President Kennedy. The deep state is not a territory. It's a system. And you have to understand the way that works. And I'm going to get it tonight and read it from the horse's mouth, who is Professor Scott, who coined the term after 5 decades of research into the JFK assassination, drug running, intelligence, 9/11, you name it. Professor Scott was there. And, I want to point out that this isn't any kind of partisan exercise either, because Professor Scott, as we all know, is he was the ultimate professor on the left, basically, teaching there at the left coast. And he's amazing. He's in his 90s now. He's still working. And it's quite remarkable what he has given us as a foundation. It's very well researched, which is what's missing so terribly in the independent media, and why I decry it week after week is, we see the pop click stuff, the engagement farming stuff, which does not go deep. It's just a headline thing. It's a frill. It reminds me very much of when the Q stuff was happening a few years ago. This is just a quick hit thing, like, guys, I read this book, and you know what? Everything that we understood is different because, LBJ's grandmother was Czechoslovakian, and, there's a Czechoslovakian-Israeli connection. Whatever it happens to be, you're always looking in the pop click stuff at just generating engagement, because that's how you get paid on X. That's not journalism at all. It's actually disgraceful. So if you have an argument, if you have a proposition, you support it with evidence, you support it with very good theory, and I can teach you all about journalism. You can take my course by watching this program for free. It's called Dark Journalism. And the way to do that, if you're engaging to inform the public on these things, is not to just run with trends and say, well, I don't like this group, so they did it. It was the Masons. It was, it's the Vatican who did it. That doesn't work. If that drives engagement, it doesn't get you anywhere nearer to the truth. So if you're dealing with something like a state actor, then you know that it's intelligence that's breeding those types of narratives out in the public, because there's no state actor that could have performed the Kennedy assassination, because of the type of security that we have. It had to be an inside job, and that was the conclusion of Robert Kennedy. It was the conclusion of Jackie Kennedy. It was the conclusion of Jim Garrison, who's the only law official to investigate the case for murder, as a capital crime. So when you think of it this way, we have to understand the foundations. And, you know, you look at, there's over 500 books on the JFK assassination, and I would say about a dozen really crucial researchers. And they understood that it was the deep state, which is the Central Intelligence Agency with these other forces. And so you can't go individually and say, well, it was the Cubans, they had a mission to do this, or any particular entity that's a state. And this is what the original, you know, notion of the CIA was set to do, to kind of throw everyone off around it. That's why Oswald had all those credentials of being, you know, a commie who lived in Russia and wanted to get into Cuba, when in fact he worked for a right-winger named Guy Bannister, who was in charge of the UFO file. That's the depth. So you need the depth. If you go into this either with the kind of superficial, you know, the journalistic tone during the hearing was very fractured. And so I'm going to turn my attention to this hearing and tell them how they can do it better, because supposedly there's another one coming up. But unfortunately, the one that's coming up on the UFO file is going to be a train wreck, because all the people involved in it are the exact same people, Elizondo, Mellon, Grush, and all the rest, who are controlled in that system and have been propagating a false CIA UFO threat. I'm going to show how you can smash that operation and get to the truth if those people on that committee, Luna's committee, Burchett and the others, Congressman Burchett, if they're listening, and I know that they do watch this program, then I'm going to show you, I'm going to give you the tools to do it, and then it's going to be up to you to do it. If you hang around with a bunch of inside CIA people who say, we have to get that government, you're not doing anything for the public, you know, because they are the government. They're sent in there to whitewash you guys. And then you whitewash the public, and that's the end of that. And they're like, hey, we did all this transparency. Isn't it great? You have all those JFK files, but you don't have the Joannides files, which was the entire point of the exercise. So how can you have everything if they left the most crucial files behind? That is the question. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. Deep tonight in X Series 195. This is the JFK files Blackout by the CIA and the UFO file Hijack. Those two go together because, remember, the JFK assassination is the investigation into the UFO file. We're going to take your questions in the second half of tonight's program, as I mentioned. And Miss Olivia, how's the temperature?
Good. Andy B says, Luna hearing equals clown show. And Susurration says, the idiots on the committee have not done their homework. They are just playing politics. No gravitas whatsoever. They even confused Oliver Stone with Roger Stone. Lord help us.
Well, look, I'm going to give them credit for doing the committee, okay? I'm going to say the committee was disrupted by bad questions, which came predominantly from Democrats who were trying to score political points by saying, oh, you know, Trump and USA Aid or whatever, which had nothing to do with the topic. And then one of the witnesses was someone from the National Archives, and he was like, I decry that Social Security numbers were released. You know, well, the stuff involved here goes back to 1963. You think any of those people are still alive? So there's no privacy issue there. And, you know, the National Archives guy, he didn't even belong in the panel, in my opinion, except, you know, he kept asking for more money for National Archives. And I think it was great that they had Stone there, and Stone with DiEugenio, who's done some good books. And, you know, like I said, these deep state researchers are very hardcore, but they don't deal with the crucial aspect, which is the UFO file. If you don't deal with that, you're driving with one eye closed. And that's part of the problem here. But nonetheless, I've always given them props, even though, you know, they'll ridicule UFO researchers. And I've said this before, if the UFO field had the deep state researchers, it would be an unstoppable force. Because one thing that the UFO researchers have, they do not have the deep skills of the deep state researchers. This is the problem. They don't understand how the government works. They don't understand assassinations. They're very fly-by-night group, and I've dealt with them for years, and they actually shy away from this kind of depth, and they have a lot of political partisanship, and predominantly left-wing. That doesn't help when you're trying to get to the root of all this, because there's no particular party that runs this. And the other thing that the deep state researchers have is a knowledge of the history of this. So like I was saying about the, TikTok, pop click stuff that you see on X and everywhere else, there's no depth. It's just headline grabbing stuff. Guys, I read this book. Guys, here's a file I found in the CIA. It proves, my thing. But there's no support for it. It's just a daily headline. And the next day they back off from it. And I'm just going to make this mention here, which is, do you remember the last time I addressed you? I was talking about RFK Jr. And the reason I brought him up was he was making some very bold statements and cutting down the Department of HHS dramatically and doing incredible work. And out of the blue, he started to get attacked by these very same people, the guys people. And I pointed them out before, like Candace Owens and stuff. And what did they say? They said he's being blackmailed and all these terrible things. And guess what? A week later, there's nothing. There's no proof. They've run away from that story, right? All those people. So the pop clickers who love the engagement, they don't stick with it, do they? And they don't have any facts. There's no blackmail on RFK Jr. And the idea that you can just say that with no evidence and say, I'm going to release all this, and then nothing comes out, but then there's no ramifications for you because, it's just a pop click environment, right? Well, for me, see, I thought originally, because when I was around mainstream journalism, I thought there really needs to be a strong foundation in independent journalism. So I adopted dark journalism. And then I thought there's going to be a whole thing that's going to grow up around independent media and alternative media, and it's going to provide a great counterpoint to mainstream media. And then all of these things happened, especially during COVID. All these outlets and all these groups came into the independent media. But what's happened now is you've got the corporate media, which is one type of state-paid media, and they block anything. They still stick to the, in the case of JFK, for example, they're still at, Oswald up in the 6th floor with an old gun and the magic bullet and all that nonsense. They're still supporting that, believe it or not, as are most history books and high school books and everything else, which is absurd. It has been, it's been disproven how many times, This is getting generationally ridiculous. We're in 2025. This thing happened 62 years ago. And you already had declarations in 79. It was a conspiracy. Congress gave you that. There are already declarations in the 90s by the ARRB. The CIA was involved. So this is old stuff. But the problem is the fight, the battle, the forces that are involved have never admitted it. So we've never technically been able to move the ball downfield, except that people understand, if they get polled, they're like 7 out of 10 of them say, yeah, we understand. Basically, the government lied about this and the CIA was involved. So there's that disconnect between the public on the ground in this whole situation, this whole circus sideshow. So what you need to do, I think, is, what I've seen is you have the mainstream thing. So if you create an independent media as a counterpoint to it, if you are the mainstream media and you lose viewers to that independent media, you need to co-opt it and astroturf it, which is what they've done. And now you have a different kind of paid media. So the second paid media is now independent media. So literally you need a third version, which is all about having evidence, facts, and getting to the bottom of this. That's dark journalism. That's the kind of stuff that we do here, but you can create a whole field of independent journalism that does that. Not this environment, because this environment, people just say stuff and it doesn't mean anything. So the mainstream media lies, the independent media lies. Then what do? Then you're really in trouble.
Well, there's just no consequences for rumor mongering, right?
Yeah,
in fact, they get rewarded for it.
The RFK story is a perfect example, and because they were, and they were pretty large accounts like Owens and others. They were saying all this stuff. There's nothing. They don't have anything. Zip. So, if you've got it, show it, right? If you've got evidence, good. We present evidence every week on this show, evidence that you can take to the bank. And if there's theorizing, fine, theorizing's great. But you can't come out and say this person is guilty of this or guilty of that. And so you see a lot of that. That's the thing to boot out and really put the brakes on the independent side, because that's a different kind of paid media. And I hate to say it with people, and there's so many of them on the conservative side that get like this, and I don't approve. One of the things I'll say about Owens is I saw in some of those conservative junkets when they're like, hey, get a chance to meet this journalist or that journalist. That's great. But guess what? It was $30,000 for 15 minutes. How are you going to get any kind of honesty in that environment? You won't. I don't know who's running those things, probably her millionaire husband who's connected with Tate or whatever. But, there's so many of those, and it's not just Owens, but there's a number of them. And so you could say really it's been infiltrated on a heavy duty level. So that's one thing. But when you get to the JFK case, it's muddying the waters there, not having the background and not knowing how to do the research is a big problem, because what happens is you ends up with two different bad versions of the story. You've got the junk conspiracy over here, which is paid, and you have the corporate junk conspiracy, which is the official version, which doesn't tell you anything. So what happens to the actual story? And that's what we need to get to. And we'll get into some of that tonight. I'm going to give you that real story as best as I can with evidence and facts and the background of it. Because remember, when you deal with the JFK assassination, it's not something that you can turn into a pop click thing, because we've had researchers of the highest caliber who've lived and died studying it. I think of Jim Marrs and my many conversations with him, interviews and everything else, and all the books that he did, including Crossfire being one of the foundations of the JFK movie, which brought so much of that out, along with Garrison's book. Professor Scott, just incredible. Paris Flamand, all these people did all the research and gave us that platform. And we can use their reasoning and integrate it, for the times that we're in. That's what we've tried to do on this show. And if you don't have that background, you start to engage in the same thing that the UFO field gets into, which is a lot of sensationalism, News Nation, going over the top. The guy talking about, oh yeah, I saw this egg and then I felt love for the egg and all that. This is where it goes. It's you remember the Talking Heads song, We're on a Road to Nowhere? It's a road to nowhere. And that's, it's a total cul-de-sac dead end. So you can break through that by getting to the core of it. Now, I'll tell you, in the JFK case, the deep state researchers have gotten very far in implicating the Central Intelligence Agency. That's good. The thing that they don't have is that aerospace UFO file piece. I'm going to give you that tonight. And we're going to shake up that committee while it exists, because remember, it's a very small window that these committees exist in the first place. And like I said, in the second half of tonight's show, we'll take your questions. I have a few headlines to read, and then we're going to jump into analyzing that committee. But what else you got going on?
Daniel is asking, DJ, what do you think about Milei from Argentina and the Hitler migration info out?
Yeah, I want to see it. Now, it's been indicated that it's going to come out. And we've heard this for years, and it's interesting because when I read the diary of JFK, he was doing some journalism work after he was brought to Berlin after the war, and he was talking and musing there about how the people in Germany didn't believe that Hitler was dead, and neither did the Russians during that period. And then he adds a little aside, I don't believe it either. So that's how it was. The people who were in the know in that period, they didn't buy that story of the suicide and the burning of bodies and all that stuff. And we all know that the medical evidence that, got dragged off to Russia, that never amounted to very much either. So it's certainly possible that Hitler escaped to Argentina, as a number of Nazis did. And of course, they certainly would have taken the top dog with them. I don't know how much is going to be revealed there, but I know that Argentina holds a great deal of the puzzle on a number of these things, including the advanced technology piece, of course, with so much of that, and the Bell technology, as we've analyzed here on this program, and how all of that ended up going into Argentina and probably made it to America sometime in the 1960s with the sighting of the Kecksburg incident. So I'm sure there's a lot to come, and when those files come out, we'll be looking at them closely. Yeah, what else you got?
Nana says Dr. Joseph has a picture of him in a beer garden in the 50s, doesn't he?
Yes. And there are other reports that have been, I've read this stuff for at least 15 years, but there's one very deep account about Hitler's nephew and niece. Now, we know one of his nephews publicly was against him and all the rest, but that he had a niece and a nephew who were fled to Argentina and then were educated in America and actually were in Arizona and then New Mexico. So there was a pretty strong trail there. And of the nephew that we know about and who is public and who was against Hitler and all that, his kids all changed their name and stuff, as you can imagine. It's probably a pretty good idea. But no, there's, of course, when it comes to history, we've been given a certain kind of history, but other deals are made in the background. And certainly Hitler had some kind of deal. There's the famous story of the plane that takes off before the Allies come in full to Berlin, and it takes off right in the street. But somehow it's not shot down as it heads off into its journey to South America. And it looks like there was a deal there that let this plane go, and we'll move along with our history. Maybe the Bush family can tell us a little of that history. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is X Series 195, the JFK Files Blackout UFO File Hijack. I'll tell you, this documentary that I'm shooting about JFK is very much, this is kind of a prelude here in this episode to what you're going to be seeing with that. So we're very happy to be bringing you this. I'm going to go a little bit into the committee, and then I'm going to show you also a very important whistleblower who I spoke to, and now I've spoken to members of his family. He recently passed away. He was elderly, but he was a national security advisor to President Kennedy. And I think more blockbuster information is going to come out about him, but I'm going to give you some of those blockbusters tonight. And it's going to be very important for us to realize how this information coalesces. But one thing I can tell you for sure, which he revealed to me and revealed publicly, was that JFK was dealing heavily on the UFO side and was, in fact, making overtures to the Russians in relation to sharing the UFO file. This is the nature of the problem, as we've brought forward in the testimony of Douglas Caddy. And one of the things I'm going to propose to Representative Luna, who I said, I think, she's trying to do a good job with that committee. I don't think there's any question about that. I don't think that she has the right people around her on it. But I'm going to suggest to her that, I would like to give her the information so she could bring forward the daughter of this whistleblower, myself and Douglas Caddy, to give her the UFO file piece with full evidence and people who were genuine witnesses with impeccable credentials around it. That will smash the effort of the CIA obfuscation of the JFK file and the UFO file. Then you're getting somewhere. And so I'm going to make that segment during this episode tonight. Let's go back to this committee hearing for a moment. As I mentioned, Oliver Stone was there, and he gave, I think, some of the best, just saying the entire case was bungled. The CIA's footprints were all over it. You need to reinvestigate it from bottom to top. Morley gave his testimony there, which was effective around the CIA directors lying. And of course, Eugenia was backing up Oliver Stone with facts here and there. And like I said, the National Archives guy was just, nowhere. He just was obviously some anti-Trump guy. And what he was saying had no place in this. He should have been talking about getting to the truth for the government and getting that out to the public, because the public has a right to know, not saying, oh, I can't believe I got these orders to get this stuff out. I didn't have time to redact everything. Now, here's a problem with the JFK committee leading into the UFO file committee. I'm glad there's going to be a second hearing on the JFK side, because she can use some of this information and get a real hearing, because that hearing was ridiculous. Everyone agrees it was a bust, even with those good witnesses. But now the UFO hearing, they're heating up, and guess who's there? Well, let's see what we got here. We've got Luna with Lou, and And there is, of course, Tim Burchett, who is the other congressman running the committee. Well, that's good. Burchett's looking for some truth there. But we've got Lion Lou in the middle of it. Lou, the CIA, DIA agent who's been running a false UFO threat program, who's lied to the public many, many times demonstrably and always worked for the government, never quit, pretended to be a whistleblower, but I proved that he was actually still working for the government at that time. And then his financier, benefactor, and the person who controls all the whistleblower, the DOD billionaire Chris Mellon. And that's Mellon there, the tall guy. And, you know, we've already had all the nonsense and wrestling matches with Mellon, where, of course, his cousin John Warner, who is the son of the late Senator Warner and heiress Catherine Mellon, he's come on this program and talked about the UFO threat that his cousin is pumping up. And the cousin's response was, your dad liked me better than he liked you. You know, but Mellon, I heard from the horse's mouth there when I was talking to Grush, and he said, I can't come in your program because Mellon will get very upset and he controls, you know, what the whistleblowers do. This is a big, big problem. So he's sitting there squatting in the middle of this transparency thing. You have this DOD billionaire who's known as the mayor of Area 51 because he controlled it for 20 years. And, you know, you can't get transparency from these types of intel people. This is the problem. You know, uncovering the truth, right? But they're all CIA spooks. So Luna, you're not going to get any answers from these people. And then you're going to get, you know, once in a while, guys like Schellenberger, who is, you know, a nice guy, a smart guy, but he doesn't know anything about the UFO file. He literally said, oh, I just started looking at it last year and all these intel people started giving me all this information. So, you know, that's what you're going to get. And it'll be an entire exercise in futility where the very thing you're going after, which is to shake up the CIA, get transparency, get new people installed, and get the truth to the American people regarding the historical record and the murder of the 35th president of the United States, you can't get it with the likes, and the UFO file, you can't get it with the likes of Elizondo, who's run by Clapper, you know? And I pointed this out for years, and I remember when I first pointed it out, everyone said, you don't have any evidence for that, blah, blah, blah. Well, how about him including a picture with Clapper in his own book and saying he's my best friend? He worked for Clapper, you know? That's all. Lou's just working. There's nothing personal in it. As I said, investigative journalism is adversarial journalism, but it can't be personal. He just, you know, he's at work. He's doing the UFO threat program for the intel community. So, but now that we know that, we can't let him get into key positions like running the UFO committee for Luna. That's a big problem, isn't it? Well, she's already said that she's going to have Grush running it. And, you know, one thing I can say about Grush when I talked to him is I felt like he wanted to be honest about these things, but he was very clear that Mellon was controlling his actions. So what good is that? You're not going to get any truth out of these people because they're being run by an intelligence program. How can you investigate the intelligence program with people who are working for it? Doesn't make any sense. So you're going to have to take an entirely different tack, and I can give you some keys as to how to do that. It'll shake up a lot, but if you're serious about shaking things up, and if it's not just hype about headlines or whatever, then you can get something real here tonight, and I can give you some of that information about how to do it. The first thing is no CIA involved in the UFO panel, on the JFK side, none, zero involvement of CIA people. That's how you'll get some breathing room for the truth. And also the people who are claiming to be whistleblowers on the UFO side, you know, you're going to have to go through them and get them to swear under oath that Chris Mellon didn't put them in that position and that they aren't answerable to Chris Mellon. So that's going to be absolutely crucial. And then the other thing that you could do with the committee that I mentioned, if you had somebody like Caddy and, as I said, the son of Harold Malmgren, Pippa, who is very well respected in government circles, you could really get somewhere in terms of the truth. The other thing, as I've mentioned on this program, and I'll continue to reiterate it until it gets floated, which is putting former Deputy CIA Director Bobby Inman, who seemed to want to give some disclosure points there back in the day. I think he's 92 years old now. Put him under oath and ask him one question. Why did you give the Career Intelligence Medal to George Joannides, who the CIA is still withholding 44 files in the JFK assassination? It's the crucial question. This is how you can run the committee. That's how you can get answers. And it's how you can combine the research and the breakthrough around the UFO file with the assassination of President Kennedy, which is clearly, if you investigate it, an intelligence aerospace operation. And if you go very deep, you're going to find the advanced technology right in the heart of it. I'm going to show you how to go deep in that. And I'm going to give credit to the committee. I think if they want to go deep, you know, you're going to have the tools. Can you do it? Can you do it? That's going to be the challenge here. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. Boy, it's X Series 195, the JFK files. Block, the blackout there on the CIA side with the UFO file hijack. That's all revealed here tonight with intel very, very deep and thwarting these transparency operations. We're going to be taking your questions in the second half of tonight's program. Miss Olivia, what do you got?
Ray Nabosny says, have DJ say hi to James Hetfield of Metallica. He's listening. Excellent.
Well, James, it's great to have you here. And I've listened to Metallica for years. It's glad to know that you're out there. I want to make an example here, one more example dealing with this committee. Remember now, in November, somebody in Congress who's looking for answers around UFOs and things of this nature is Nancy Mace, the congresswoman from South Carolina. She puts together a committee, and she has Lou, you know, counterintelligence agent Lou, on it, and Schellenberger and all these other people. And Schellenberger releases this information and says, I have this immaculate constellation thing. It's the biggest breakthrough. And by the way, you know, I won't make it available publicly, but if you want the name, if you want the full info behind this, it's available as part of my subscription series or whatever. And I'm glad that he has a subscription series or whatever. But I think if it comes to something that important, just let the damn information out. So in fact, at a certain point he does and says, the name of the program is Immaculate Constellation. And so she's like, oh my God, we're breaking Immaculate Constellation. And, you know, Lou's like, yes, Immaculate Constellation. And then nothing happens. And then there's nothing that backs that up. There's no program. There's no documents. Zip. You got nothing, and no one talks about it anymore. That's just because they wanted the headline for the week. I don't know what kind of intel game they played with Schellenberger, but it's a joke. So this is how they waste time. And also, remember, the reverse thing that can happen with a committee is you can identify people who genuinely have the information. So it can become kind of a reverse intel exercise if you're not careful with it. So, you know, we got all these things about, oh, you know, I've got the whole thing about where the UFOs are in this hangar and everything else. It's all in that Immaculate Constellation program. And me and my CIA friends are going to go there and make that government give us the truth. None of that happened, all right, because the CIA doesn't want to give the public the truth. And that for sure, you know, aspects and elements in the CIA want to know where that, you know, let's say the recovered technology is. They're never going to give that to the public. They want to give the public misdirections, and if they get in a tight spot, they'll give them something that looks like the truth, but isn't. I mean, that's what counterintelligence is all about. So we have to get very real on this. And so, you know, but you're going to have, it's going to be very clearly delineated and bifurcated. Here's how it's going to work. You're going to have potent, real journalism. I call it dark journalism on this stuff, which gets right to the facts and doesn't allow for all this frills. And you're going to have like News Nation, you know, who just wants the headline and wants to get the pop click people on. That's how they're going to run it. And they have tremendous resources. They have tremendous bots. You know, when I mention Elizondo or whatever, something like 30 or 40 bots show up immediately defending him. You know, that's a program. So those people aren't human. Once in a while, there's some human somewhere, but somebody probably in Manila or something is just operating all those things. We've seen the programs about how they do this. So you're not going to really solve something like the UFO file or the Kennedy assassination in the digital space. It's not going to happen. What you can do, you can take something that comes from the deep research and bring it into that digital space. But you have to be very suspect about the kind of manipulated information and the way that it's easy to do and magnify on the technological edge. And, we talk a lot about the dangers inherent in some of the technology that we use. I've always seen the incredible benefit of it. And God knows I love technology. I edited a tech magazine for years. So, when it comes to these things, I would say we need to take the proper legal approach. We need to take the proper editorial approach and deal with each aspect. So if you're dealing with aerospace, then you get people who know aerospace and have investigated aerospace. And if you're talking about organized crime, then you get people who know something about that. This is how you'll understand it. It's a multidisciplinary approach for a true independent media. That's really what you need. And you don't have it. I can tell you that. What you get is a lot of people who get very confused, and then they get hooked on one particular thing because somebody's played into their bias or prejudice or something. And so they're like, oh, I know what that is. And then it becomes like a sports team thing where you just kind of root for this guy to go down or whatever. And they give you the 2 minutes hate of whichever political figure you don't like, like a Hillary type or whatever. And they serve them up on a platter. And, Orwell was a great, really a fantastic writer. And one of the things he understood, because he studied intelligence, was that in 1984, what happens with Winston is he sees when they give him the 2 minutes hate, it's a brainwashing process. And so you get the 2 minutes hate, and then you go back to your regular everyday life. You get that questioning side out of your mind, and you get to hate on a particular figure. That's how to keep a control around the narrative, keep a control around people's thinking. And I see it all the time. I see it on a regular basis. So there's such a desire to hate and resent in all this. And I can't speak to you on like a spiritual level. I'm not here to preach to you about it. What I am saying is you can be manipulated through your own resentments. So when it comes to journalism, you need to have a much more objective approach at the outset. That's one. And then two, that kind of banal thing that the mainstream media pours over everything, like the UFO file, constantly like trying to debunk anyone who's thinking outside the box. That's the other extreme. So you need to somehow walk a tightrope right between those two factors in order to get to the truth. And since we're talking about JFK tonight, and I think it's crucial while the files are being released, while the hearings are happening, to really drive the point home here with people who understand the case and who have studied it and understand its ramifications. It's very important for us to understand what Kennedy was doing that would end up having him assassinated and the plot covered up for 60 years. Why would an intelligence agency do that and then cover it up? Well, it is the murder at the heart of the deep state. And I'm going to show you how we can open some of that up tonight. And maybe with the help of the Ideas Room, we're going to be able to bring some transparency on this. Tonight, before I go any further in this deep dive, what do you got?
Dag Forster says, on X, Jefferson Morley asked what he should bring up at the next hearing with Luna. I sent him Mae Brussels' article, quote, Nazi connections and the JFK conspiracy.
Oh, that'll scare the devil out of him. But you're right. See, you're on the right track. This is the thing. The deep state researchers, tell Morley then to investigate the UFO file, and he won't, because listen, this is an interesting thing, and it happens to any researcher in all of this. So I'm just pointing this out in relation to Morley, but as we know, I like his work, and I'm glad he was on the committee. But here's the problem. If you are hell-bent on not being the guy who seems very far out, that's how you get to 2025, and the story coming out of the hearings thing is, hey, researcher goes from being a skeptic about this to believing the CIA did it.
Big yawn. It's
not a story. That's not the story. The story is, we got to the heart of it. We smashed the CIA operation after 60 years. The case fell apart. It has nothing to do with somebody saying, well, I think based on, it's 2025. Now I've looked at all this and I think, yeah, maybe the CIA actually did do it. Well, that just means you were in denial all those years. What about, Mark Lane, who in the 1960s said the CIA was involved? He was 60 years ahead of you. That's the way I would look at it. So, I'm glad people get on board, but let's get beyond that stage and get deep now into why they did it. One, who were the principal players involved, and how that changed the trajectory of the entire country. And by the way, the reason that they assassinated President Kennedy over the UFO file, we never have gotten any kind of real accounting about the technology involved in the UFO file, the history involved in it. We've gotten more obfuscation in relation to the UFO file than to the assassination itself. So, and this whole thing, the false thing about, let's talk about UAP and, the CIA sending their agents out because they want to talk about the UFO stuff and love you and give you the truth. Let's get real. That's not potent journalism. I don't even know where that stuff comes from. That's where you get, if I were to just muse on this for a moment, if you'll indulge me. When you get people who write in the UFO field, they are trying to get to facts and details about particular cases. They're trying to get to experience modes, factors that are involved in identifying these things. So they're looking at it on that level. That's fine. But the depth of what takes place in those types of experiences and the forces involved in covering them up is really a better function for the deep state researchers who've uncovered crimes, like when the CIA goes into a country, overthrows the leader, and then allows drug running through that country. You have to understand how deep that kind of research is versus a cursory study of how somebody's life was impacted by, having their family had a history of UFO sightings or whatever. You have to be able to take that mindset that can study and analyze the CIA practice involved in deep operations in the deep state and apply it to the UFO file. So when we're looking at the UFO aspect, we must take the template that somebody could bring in on the intelligence side, on the analysis side, and those nest of details, and bring that in, as opposed to looking for a wild headline like, hey, this proves that UFOs exist. That's what the UFO field does. So it doesn't have many credible authors. It has headline chasers predominantly. And then it has other people who you think might have some kind of depth to them. And then you probe a little bit and you realize, they think that the Mellon CIA operation is legit. So they don't. So what you need is a new field there. And if you're going to get a mainstream version of the UFO file that's real, that's not the counter narrative that the CIA is putting out for their own purposes, which I believe also involves a UFO threat propagation to eventually claim emergency powers as the result of a sky event, like the drone surge that we had. And it's very interesting in this regard. They just had a 60 Minutes program where they, brought on the COG chief, the combatant commander of NORTHCOM, and Gregory Guillot, who comes out of MacDill, which is a long history, again, of UFO file activities, as did the previous COG commander. And he's sitting there and he's saying, he says threat about 7 times in one paragraph. And he said, we weren't able to analyze the threat because we were having these drone swarms over our bases in Langley and all the rest of it. This is before, by the way, the stuff was happening in New Jersey. And he said, we always assumed that the drone stuff would happen, the unmanned aerial vehicles would happen in other countries. We didn't think it would come here. Really ridiculous stuff. And of course, Guillot would become the absolute ruler of the United States in the event that they hit the emergency powers switch for continuity of government. We've done many shows on continuity of government, but what I'll say here is it's one of the least known functions of the government. And the public needs to be much more aware of the people who possess this power. And we've had many warnings from JFK on down through the years about this continuity of government program. Even Gary Hart, of all people, studied it and said, there's a level at which there's an entirely secret system of government ready to take power as soon as we get the right emergency. And as we saw with the COVID aspect, when they seized so much of your regular everyday life, that that overreach of government is right there at any time. During 9/11, the TSA and the Patriot Act and all that, the encroachment on your constitutional rights and abilities is startling. So I think, let's say what we need to do is have a different kind of a conversation here, which is assumes, it doesn't start out just, oh, I'm cynical of any government. I'm not saying that, but it assumes and understands that there are forces inside of that government that want that kind of central martial control and have been scheming over years about how to get it. That is that whole parallel structure, the deep state, and how it operates. So when we get into secrecy, whether it's the secret space program, the UFO file, the assassinations, the continuity of government program, the public has to have a way, it needs to find a way to penetrate that secrecy, or ultimately end up paying the price of being the puppet and the patsy when it comes out. So I think that's how we need to look through the lens here. Now, I'm going to give you some details and put some meat on the bones as far as the case goes. And before I do that, Miss Olivia, please rescue us now.
I'm just thinking about sort of Belial. I'm trying to take a 60,000 foot view, and how
I was talking a lot about Belial when I was shooting this week.
That is, you could think of modern Belial as the system of the central banking warfare model.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
And, a lot of people want to blame, Israel, as if everyone in Israel, or the Jews, as if every single Jew, are responsible for JFK's assassination. And
Oh,
I'm
it's
just
ridiculous.
thinking, well, of course, on the face of it, it's ridiculous. But
fundamentally because there's no state actor involved, it's the deep state.
Well, and I think probably the way to explain it best is like it's a system, and it's sort of Belial in the system, and the system is set up. Some people could say Satanist, some people could say evil, but we tend to use the term Belial, and I think it's useful going, are there bad actors in this group and that group and that group and that group who all got together and said, we need to get rid of this guy, and we're all going to benefit in different ways from getting rid of him. That is actually the way to see it.
That's the coalescence of interests that are involved there. And it's absolutely true. Look, the deep state, as I said, is a system. It's not a place. There's no state actor involved in the assassination. It's very important. And when we get into Professor Scott's work, I'm going to read a little bit about how that deep state operates. And remember, the way that he described it was as a parallel structure or system to that overt government. So you have the covert thing underneath there, which mirrors this thing. And then once in a while, through deep events like the Kennedy assassination, 9/11, Watergate, that system steps in. We don't know very much about that deep state system, by the way, because what you do is you see their footprints. They make some kind of policy change through a deep event like 9/11, and then they step back and we're left with all the rubble of the things that they did and trying to track it back. So look, in the case of the unspooling of the thread in the Kennedy assassination, it's 1963. How far off is the public from this secret system that we can't even get the truth from the Joannides files 62 years later? I mean, that is the power that's been holding in the middle there. So you need to take it in that sense. And there's going to be all kinds of countries involved on all kinds of different levels. People will be, you're going to find that the intelligence agencies, from the KGB, French intelligence, Iranian intelligence, MI6, the CIA, there's an interweaving of these intelligence agencies, and they also spy on each other. But when they get together to do a particular thing, you're going to find that's where the system evolves from. And remember, the way that Scott describes the deep state is like this, that on the very bottom level, you have that organized crime factor. And then you have the intelligence services, like the Central Intelligence Agency as the layer above that. And then the contracting agencies, like the Booz Allen Hamilton agencies beyond that. And the contracting agencies are a little further even outside the law. With the CIA, you're already outside the law because of the way the statute was written. But then the contracting agencies, you know, they don't have as much accountability to the government as the CIA even does. Then when you go further, it is, you know, the oil companies, the tech companies, and the real power system on the financial side, and then the management of that financial system. There is a deep state a system. What I would add to that also is the protectors of the X-Protect group, the protectors of that very secret technology involved in the UFO file. So when you're looking at it from that perspective, it's has to be understood as a system. And when you understand it as a system, you're getting somewhere. You know, you're getting closer. But yeah, Belial, absolutely. And it's interesting. Remember, the people like Maxwell and Epstein, they were involved in a Belial cult, as we showed in our HOTZONE documentary, Hacking Atlantis. And it's startling to think of the things that they were doing and the people they were doing it with, like Marvin Minsky and, you know, so many of the top scientists in the world. They were sending them down there, very, very deep in the ocean in their special submarine to observe what? This is a very interesting question that we raise in that documentary. And part 2 of that documentary, or the second part of Hacking Atlantis, is coming up. Even more surprises there. Wow. What else you got?
Martin K. O'Connor wants to know, has DJ read 1,000 Days JFK in the White House by Arthur M. Schlesinger Jr.?
Yes. You know, I read that I think when I was like 17 or something. And that's where I got the first hint that, you know, the Kennedy thing was very, very different. There was another book called The Imperial Presidency that Schlesinger wrote, and I started to be like, oh, you know, CIA used the mafia to assassinate people. So there were little steps there with Schlesinger. But one thing that came out in these records that I think was very important was his recommendation to Kennedy, who said, how can I break up the CIA? Give me the system about how we can do this. And he gave him options based on other countries about how they could do it. And they held back that memo for 60 years. The reason is, one, they probably didn't want to give anyone the tools for how to split up this organization. And two, it demonstrated the level and the depth of Kennedy's dedication and seriousness to getting rid of the Central Intelligence Agency. And so it showed them clearly as the enemies that they were. And remember, this wasn't some gripe on the part of President Kennedy. This is why it's important to know the background. Kennedy came into office with a lot of knowledge through his father, who was a very successful businessman and had been involved with very shady characters, and got into government and become the first leader of the SEC, overseeing and all the reforms for FDR after the Great Depression because of all the abuse that took place in the stock system, which Kennedy knew all about. Because, you know, he'd run banks and trading houses and everything else. He was very deep in the system, including buying some of the first major Hollywood properties and having theater chains throughout the country. This is somebody who understood how the whole system worked. And but the Depression, the Great Depression, really shook up Joseph Kennedy, who became the ambassador to the UK and took his family over there. So, you know, JFK is growing up at the court of St. James. He's getting all that knowledge from those English diplomats and that political system about how all this stuff works. He's being sent around Europe and all the rest of it. And so picking up the European political tack and really understanding how the world works, this is all when he's a teenager. So by the time you get Kennedy going into Congress at the age of 29 in 1946, he has a great background already. His father has given him that background. And the father, who plans to run for president himself in 1940, makes an unfortunate comment, which says the UK should just make some kind of peace settlement with Hitler because they're never going to be able to resist that military machine. it's so defeatist that FDR gets the excuse to say, this guy sounds like a sympathizer, boot him out. And he gets rid of him, finally. He always considered him as kind of a challenger to his presidential role. He was always worried about what he might do. And Joe Kennedy was starting to turn against FDR and saying, I can keep us out of the war. And so he might have been a major contender against FDR in the 40 election. But so he slides down that path, and that's the end of his political career. All he can do is project all of that idealism, but also personal willpower into his sons to make them president. And he's going to make Joseph Jr., his son, president. But Joe Jr. takes on a mission very late in the war, 1944. And it's a dangerous proposition, but he's carrying these sensitive munitions, and the plane explodes. There's many plane crashes, of course, and tragedies in the Kennedy family. It's very strange because you have all these incredible, gifts and, basically, even though they were millionaires, they were the billionaires of their time. But you have these incredible pattern of tragedies. And so he turns to his son, John, who he never really had thought about for political office. And he had kind of put all of his hopes in the oldest son. And he had actually some issues with JFK because he thought JFK's, interests ran to other places. JFK wanted to be a journalist. He was interested in, the world and how it worked. He was interested in entertainment. So he wasn't really a natural political type, oddly enough. And when they elect him in 1946 as the congressman, he's got, though, this incredible background because also the incredible family friend is James Forrestal. And Forrestal is, he becomes the first defense secretary. He's in charge of the Navy, but he also has this great background in Wall Street and all the rest of it. And as a fellow Catholic, he befriends JFK and they become best friends, and he takes him everywhere. He takes him over, as I mentioned, to Berlin to see the rubble after the fact. But what happens is in 47, Forrestal gets knowledge of the UFO file. He passes that on to JFK. And it's very interesting because I was mentioning Malmgren, who is the whistleblower, Harold Malmgren, who passed away. I got to communicate with a little bit. Unfortunately, we didn't arrange for our interview in time, but he had put enough things on the record, and I also sensed a reluctance to put the full record on there. But I learned that his daughter Pippa, who I've been able to communicate with, that she did get some footage of him just before he died relating to this. He was a remarkable guy, and he served as a national security advisor in 4 different presidential administrations, but particularly as a young man at the age of 27 in the JFK, and during some really crucial times like the Cuban Missile Crisis. And he helped to create that middle ground so that we didn't have a nuclear exchange. So he got some incredible things to happen. He suffered a severe illness in the last decade, but then he came back, and part of his therapy was sharing his thoughts on Twitter. And so when I saw the things that he was putting out there, I said, oh, this is interesting because Pippa, I had done a few things about Pippa a couple of years ago because I mentioned her because here was somebody who was coming out of the blue who had a foreign policy, like a think tank background, and she was talking about UFOs. And I said, oh, this is interesting. Later, I found out that, it was over the fact that her dad was so closely involved in this. But his involvement in that Kennedy White House, I'm going to read some excerpts that he just put out publicly on Twitter. And then I'm going to read something that Pippa, his daughter, wrote. Of course, I invited Pippa with her footage and with her own testimony and everything to come on this program. And I certainly hope that she does. I know that the other groups, the people that I have issues with, like Chris Mellon and stuff, are also in that mix. And so they might put the nix on that, as it were. But she's always welcome here. And like I said, I think she'd make an excellent witness in the Luna hearings because you can tie in that UFO part with the JFK part. It's very clear now with Malmgren that he was talking about JFK and the UFO file and the things that JFK was up against in relation to this. There's a lot of support there for the things that we've put forward, that JFK was making this deal with the Russians. We've put that evidence on the record that he wanted to share the high threat cases of the UFO file, and he ordered the CIA to do it, and that they didn't want to do it for a number of reasons. One, that aerospace wing inside the government was largely based on this paperclip aspect. At least there were enough powerful scientists from that program in it, and they had just fought the Russians and, had killed 30 million Russians. And the last thing they wanted to do was share this with their enemy, because it was the top secret in the United States government, and they had integrated themselves into that government. Sometimes people will take this and say, well, the Nazis got into America, but everything else was clean. It's not true. The Russians got a number of Nazi scientists. Look, after Germany was defeated, it was a brain trust. Everybody wanted those guys because they were the incredible brain trust. And we know from some of the testimony of John Warner on this program about his grandfather, Paul Mellon, that Paul Mellon, after the war, he goes into Germany when they're divvying everything up, and he's in Peenemünde, and he's standing there on this saucer-shaped object that's the size, he said, of a football field and a half. Well, that never got accounted for in any of the histories that we know about. So obviously there's a secret program on the technological side involved there. That's a private conversation, by the way, taking place between a couple of relatives. I think it's pretty good. But I want to say this about Malmgren, that his testimony really starting last year and the things that he was putting out publicly give no doubt to the fact that the UFO file was a major consideration and a military consideration and others in the Kennedy White House. That is the crucial factor involved there, and it supports the things that we've been doing to you over time. I'm going to read a little bit of something from Pippa Malmgren, who's, like I said, her Substack is out there, but she has a very distinguished background in all this. So she tells some stories about her dad talking about Curtis LeMay and the UFO aspect involved around some of the tests that they were doing, including the fact that they did this bluegill nuclear explosion, and they got something called a tag-along, which is a UFO came out of that, and they had to brief Kennedy on this, and Kennedy had to go to Los Alamos in '62 to talk about this. This is all crucial history that's just being added now. And of course, Malmgren, was under secrecy for a number of years, but in this last year of his life, apparently felt free enough to release some details. So here's a little bit that Pippa has to say. And like I said, I still hold out great hopes that Pippa will come on the program, because we've talked a little back and forth, and she's seen the documentary that we put out, JFK, the Final Speech, with the whole UFO file, JFK assassinated over the UFO file. And she's on the track. She's on the trail. So she goes, she's talking about this meeting that took place, which her dad was in as a national security advisor for JFK with LeMay and others, and says, so knowing all this, my father said to those assembled in the Situation Room, maybe we could just drop one like a nuke, because they might want to negotiate after that. LeMay was outraged, but the others in the Situation Room thought it was a good idea. Then Dad asked what the target would be. Obviously Moscow, replied LeMay, but if we hit Moscow, we won't have anyone to negotiate with. Who can we call? The men in the Situation Room wildly concurred with my dad. Then he said, if we let it leak the Soviets that we won't hit Moscow, maybe they won't hit Washington, D.C. These are the nature of the conversations they had to have during things like the Cuban Missile Crisis, like who's going to drop the first nuke. You can see how dangerous it was, and probably why it did attract UFO attention, if we're looking at that as an off-world observer there. LeMay was livid and stormed out of the Situation Room. It was only this last year, and my father and I had lots of leisurely time to talk and reflect, that he clocked that LeMay would not have let that anger go. I pointed out that LeMay was suspiciously absent and obviously gloating at various points around JFK's assassination. That's when Dad fully realized that the events had been influenced by a missile test that he helped run during the Cuban missile crisis, that is Operation Bluegill Triple Prime. Now, I'll tell you, this is associated around Operation Dominic. And we did an episode before any of this stuff came out, interestingly enough, on this explosion around Operation Dominic and how that explosion had no fallout. And there was this whole thing about the ripple technology. And me and Joseph Farrell did a couple of episodes on it last summer. So crucial and interesting, the timing there, because the other piece of this was coming to the surface as well. I highly recommend that episode. Okay, back to the quotes now. So, and by the way, notice the blue there with the gill. I put forward in March of 2023 that program involved on the UFO file side, the secret space program, which is about tracking the UFO file, was named Blue. And the government came out in 2024 and admitted part of that because it was starting to get around. And then I identified a number of the different programs that are called Blue. That program, the early development and observation and surveillance of the UFO file is Blue. That's where you get all the Blue Book, all those different things. Blue Gemini is also a deep part of that. The steganography is deeply there, and so note bluegill as we go along here. This bluegill triple prime refers to the fourth and final high-altitude nuclear test in the Operation Fishbowl series conducted on October 25th, 1962. That's during the Cuban Missile Crisis. From Johnston Island, aiming to study the effects of nuclear detonations as defensive weapons against ballistic missiles. Now, I'm going to skip ahead here and grab the key portions. Jeff Cruikshank has done an excellent job of detailing what happened during the test here, but in short, the missile contained an X-ray machine, and the idea was to see if the X-rays could divert or blow up an incoming ICBM if it got within a reasonable distance of it. There's 2 videos of the test, and this has been running around on YouTube, I think, since 2018 or something. But her commentary is new. The other video shows the same video of the explosion, but with a triangle that obscures the view of the orb. The X-rays knocked it out of the sky. The U.S. Navy retrieved the orb out of the ocean. I said, so Dad, you were smack in the middle of this national security emergency. What the heck did you think the orb was? He said, we called them tagalongs. I said, so you knew they weren't Russian? Yes, he said. You knew they were benign? Obviously, the word tagalong implies you saw them all the time and you knew they were harmless? Yes, he said. And you never asked what the heck is that thing? He looked a little blank. It was the military. Everything is on a need-to-know basis. Dad did ask what happened to the orb after the Navy scooped it out of the Pacific, but he was told that despite all holding Q clearances, he did not need to know. As Cruikshank explained, the retrieved orb left a radiation imprint on the Navy ship after it was retrieved. Now, here's the thing. So you have a huge nuclear test, and somehow either there was a flight path going on, this thing just got caught in it, and so they threw it off course and it crashed, and they retrieved it. So she says, here's what really matters. My dad said it was the first time we knocked a tag-along out of the sky. That's interesting. It was historic. So he flew out to Albuquerque to be briefed. Now, then Kennedy shows up and he gets briefed on it. So there's a whole thing here about the UFO file and the briefings that were going on. And Malmgren, like I said, his credentials are impeccable. He worked for 4 different presidents, and here he was as a national security advisor for the Kennedy administration. Now, a little bit more, because Bissell is involved here, and of course Bissell set up all of our UFO programs in the 40s and 50s. He got fired now, along with Allen Dulles, when Kennedy realizes that they've lied to him in relation to trying to trick him into invading Cuba over the Bay of Pigs. So Bissell, the legend, and Dulles, the legend, get fired by this uppity first-year president who's a billionaire playboy. That's how they're looking at this guy. How dare he? You know, we've been setting up the world for the past 2 decades. We beat the Germans and the Russians in World War II. What is this guy doing? So, jumping ahead, he said she's trying to get to the bottom of where the information went. So she said it was historic. He flew out to Albuquerque to be briefed by the head of the Atomic Energy Commission, Lawrence Gies, who is Jeff Bezos' grandfather. So when you see Blue Origin and the space program that Jeff Bezos is doing, that's exactly related to the Blue program again. And Bezos hasn't been, you know, kind of baptized as the space commando the way that Musk is, but he's getting there. And Blue Origin has all kinds of that imagery around that. Well, his grandfather's deeply connected into the early UFO file. All right, a little more. They apparently received materials from the crashed craft. He kept them on his desk, handed them to my dad, and asked him to describe how he felt. Dad said a voice began talking to him inside his head. Apparently, he said, some people interact with the materials and others don't. It's part of that psychic interaction. Or they may have been playing with his head, too. This led to briefings at Los Alamos and an invitation from Richard Bissell. Bissell was a legend, having been a founder of both the OSS and the CIA. Deep, deep player. He was reputed to have been in charge of Area 51. Yeah, he's the mayor of Area 51, just like Mellon was the mayor of Area 51 for a decade. He was responsible for testing and launch of the U-2 spy plane. Bissell said to my dad, "You're the youngest of the whiz kids. I'm going to tell you things because someone needs to know this in the future, and you'll still be around." They had dinner every Friday night for many months. When he passed, Bissell passed, my dad said, "We guardians of the MJ," more than once, and not just to me. People who follow the subject will know what he was referring to, of course. That's the Majestic Group, but a number of them, this is how they take it. You know, they're the guardians of the whole thing. What matters is that JFK and LBJ jumped out west to hear what had happened for themselves on December 7th, 1962. So here you have Kennedy very deeply involved in getting briefed on the UFO file, but they have their own secret program around it. Kennedy's trying to get in the middle of that, and he's showing up for these national security briefings. Now, I'm going to bring us back for a moment to an episode we did a few weeks ago about Judith Exner and her incredible role in Revelation, but she was part of this human intelligence network that Kennedy had, and he used her to interact with, she was actually close to Frank Sinatra, who introduced her to him, and she had an affair with JFK, and he used her to interact with these mafia figures, including Sam Giancana, of course, who was the top mob boss from Chicago, and really just a powerhouse, really the godfather, along with others in that area, like in that era, like Trafficante and Carlos Marcello, and really some of the, you know, heavy hitters. And, you know, like, it's almost like the Godfather, the movies, like the Barbie version of what these guys were really about. But in any case, at a certain point, he is sending Exner. This is so important, and it was revealed at the end of her life. Back and forth, she is the messenger. And Kennedy is giving her envelopes. And when she describes them, she says, it's a manila envelope. It seems like it almost like it had a magazine in it or something. Sometimes she would give them the envelope. They would look at it, put it back, and give it back. So they didn't get to keep it. And so there were a lot of, there was a whole wave of these anti-Kennedy books that came out, but the top one was called The Dark Side of Camelot, where the author, Seymour Hersh, who used to be excellent at exposing the Central Intelligence Agency, was somehow getting his intel for the book as a hit piece against Kennedy from the Central Intelligence Agency. Try that one out. I guess it was too tempting to finally get on the inside. And what takes place is fascinating because he thinks that he's getting this hit piece on Kennedy where it's like, here's this payoff and that payoff and mob and all this stuff. But at a certain point, Exner recalls opening one of the envelopes, and she didn't. I mean, the whole time that she was doing this, she kept it very, very straight. But I guess one time the curiosity just got to her. And when she opened it up, it wasn't money. It wasn't any kind of payoff. It was a blueprint for an aerospace craft. And Giancana was being used as an intermediary for Judith with these defense contractors. Give the information to Giancana, give it to Judith, back to Kennedy. Kennedy, this is how he did his human intelligence network, and I believed he learned this from his father as a way to elude the State Department, the Central Intelligence Agencies, and all these other people who were hell-bent on controlling everything that took place. There's been a few instances of this in history. Nixon got around his own Secret Service. Eisenhower got around his State Department to do the famous military-industrial complex speech by giving them a false speech and reading the real one. And Kennedy did the same thing when he gave the American University speech in 1963, where he said, what kind of a peace do we seek? And it's definitely not a Pax Americana enforced on on the world by American weapons of war. We need to examine our own attitudes towards Russia and realize we all breathe the same air and we're all mortal and we all cherish our children's future. Well, this was anathema to that deep state. He gives that speech June 10th, 1963, and it says basically, let's look at our enemies as human beings and work out some kind of a deal here. And in the background saying, I'll tell you what, our most secret thing is the UFO file, but we don't want our UFO to be mistaken as one of our craft, like if it goes over one of your nuclear facilities, as they seem to be interested in our own. Here's how we can kind of lessen tensions here. I'm going to share some of these cases so you know what's what, and here's the craft, here's what they look like, here's the pictures that we have, etc. That's what Kennedy was engaged in the last period of his life, and the Central Intelligence Agency wasn't going to have any of that. That's why when you get into the hearings and all the rest of it, they need to go and pursue these stories. Now, here's something interesting about Judith Exner, who revealed this. Exner was bugged by the FBI for 18 months during the time she had her affair with JFK. Those wiretaps, the transcripts, their reports, and everything else are all available, and that Luna Committee can subpoena the FBI to get that information. That, again, like the Joannides file, is a bombshell, and it would explode the case wide open, because then you start to see who are the military contractors, who are the defense contractors that Giancana is interacting with. What are the comments around all this? And what was the surmise of the agents involved in tracking her? There's real value in being able to do that. And it becomes an entirely different case and a different approach. Instead of looking for some, phantom back there of was it a mafia boss that ordered the hit on JFK? No, it's the deep state system, but particularly involved with the secret technology. That's the crucial aspect. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. Whew, deep tonight into X Series 195. This is JFK Files Blackout and the UFO file Hijack, which is what's going on with the transparency committees right now. The D-Class Task Force, led by Representative Luna and Burchett. And like I said, trying to get some answers on the JFK side, and I think they got some good guests there. Unfortunately, the people that they're using for the UFO one, all CIA counterintelligence liars. So that's a big problem. But I am actually recommending to that committee that they can cut through the whole thing by understanding the JFK case and the UFO file case are exactly the same. This is crucial. We're going to be taking your questions in the second half of tonight's program, which is coming up here, very shortly, actually, in the next 5 minutes. And I want to remind you before we go any further to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our newsletter. That's a free newsletter, but it keeps you in touch with us through all the intense, and I mean incredible censorship around this program for the heavy duty details that we're bringing out to the public. And, basically what happens is you'll get it once a week. It'll let you know about the incredible shows that we have coming up for you, mind-blowing X-series episodes, phenomenal interviews coming up, great guests, and of course the phenomenal mini-series documentaries, Hacking Atlantis and JFK and the UFO File. Both, now you're going to get a second installment of both of those coming up. We've been shooting them for the last couple of weeks, and boy, this stuff is getting heavy duty. I went on the Alex Jones show last Monday, and it was great, really fantastic time. And at one point, he was like, I watched the JFK, the final speech, UFO File, and let's roll out some clips of that on the show. And he did. He very, played some incredible liberal long versions of that. So the documentary got into Alex's audience. We got tremendous feedback for that. So thank you, Alex. And we're going to be doing more with Alex coming up as well. And we have another very interesting guest appearance we'll be making. I have that coming up, and I'll let you know. If you're on that newsletter list, you're going to get it first before anybody. So that's the way to do it. Miss Olivia, what do you got?
David Tormina, DJ, is the piece about Exner seeing a blueprint in the envelope in her biography? Where does she report
No,
that?
it's in the book that's supposed to be the hit job on Kennedy, which is Cy Hirsch, and it's The Dark Side of Camelot. And, the way he's doing that whole rat-a-tat thing, which is, here's Kennedy giving these payoffs to these gangsters or whatever. And just in the middle of it, snap, there you go. And it's an incredible, incredible moment because what's taking place there is she starts talking about what the vehicles are, and that they are vehicles that are unmanned. So, they're drone technology. Some of them operate on the ground. And so this is extraordinary, and it's under a layer of what looks like, Kennedy taking advantage of this young woman, having this affair with her, and then having her run around doing his errands. Certainly, there's room for that kind of analysis, but I think that the book's job was the CIA was feeling the heat after the Assassination Record Review Board. All the information, the evidence, again, was pointing to the CIA. So what do? They get this guy who's known as an honest broker, basically, Seymour Hersh, who's been critical of the CIA in the past, and they're like, we're going to give you the inside dope on Kennedy. And so that's where a lot of the stories, there's all kinds of salacious stories about Kennedy, and certainly as a millionaire and a playboy leading into the White House and all the rest of it. Some of them are true, but then others are incredibly overplayed. But Exner, there's no doubt about it, her testimony was 100% rock solid, and she was dragged into it. I did a whole episode on her, so I recommend you watch that. It's like about 3 weeks ago I did that episode. And of course, it was the charming Frank Sinatra who got her involved. And it's interesting because this is a shot of Blue Eyes before he's really famous. And what's happening here is that's a breaking and entering charge that's been brought by some kind of a jealous husband of some woman that he's seeing who's much older. But it's interesting with old Blue Eyes and how he got involved with the mafia and became such a major part of this entertainment conglomerate involving the mafia and politics. And but he was beaten as a child, and his mother beat him, and she had him grow up in this environment where she ran kind of a nightclub. And so he had the mobster and the violence thing in him from a very early age. And, the incredible achievements and everything that he had, people have often looked at him and said, why was this guy such involved with these mobsters and stuff? It was in his blood. And I think that the abusive background as well, there's something about Sinatra that we need to understand on a deep level. But one of the fascinating things is this interface, this opening that organized crime is looking for through Sinatra to Kennedy. And in the middle of that interface, Judith Exner Campbell shows up, and Kennedy does, he uses her as this major interface point with Giancana. There's no question about that. But what I've surmised and what I've sort of thought about this and theorized on it, very often in the traditional mafia books about this, they're like, JFK was doing the hit on Castro, and he was using Giancana to do it. But as we know, when the Kennedy brothers found out about the CIA's position about using gangsters to assassinate Castro, they try to shut it down. There's repeated accounts of this. So they weren't involved in any of that, and they didn't believe in executive action for overthrow of governments. That was not what they did. As a matter of fact, they instructed the government, the CIA, in regard to the government of Vietnam, not to assassinate the Diem brothers. And the CIA, the way they played it, along with the ambassador, Cabot Lodge, was to say, we never got the memo. So the assassination of the Diem brothers took place 3 weeks before Kennedy was assassinated. These guys on the intelligence side were moving the ball down the field. And they had assassinated and overthrown a number of governments. They'd replaced the leadership in the UK as well, thrown out with a plane crash. This UN director, who we finally found out 50 years later, it was somebody planted an explosive on the plane, These are the things that shook Kennedy up, and he realized these guys are out of control. How do you get them under control? And this was the battle back and forth for Kennedy's 3 years in office. And so his fight with them is an incredible legacy to us now, because I can tell you the only thing that's happened with the CIA, and I'm glad that they have Ratcliffe as a leader and all that now, because he can get through some of it, but he's still an outsider on top. But the CIA has only grown, and that whole secret structure, superstructure inside the government, you look at Homeland Security, it's 260,000 employees. And the CIA has its own Air Force. They run their own drone wars and everything else. So these are big, big problems. And they weren't solved, but there's an answer back there in that struggle between the security state and the presidency, because Kennedy understood in a real constitutional republic, the president, has the power over the security agencies, and they must answer to the president through the military. And that whole process had been subverted. And it's interesting because, of course, I've mentioned this in relation to Harry Truman. It's very important historically to note that a month to the day after the assassination, he wrote a very, very deep editorial on it, saying, I didn't set up the CIA to overthrow governments and all the rest, and it's throwing a lot of shade on America. He understood that the CIA was involved in the Kennedy assassination, and he wasn't going to have any of it. So he was the one who set it up. He knew, the Frankenstein that it was and that it had become. So we need to understand that that system just grew, and they are, they don't have the normal military function that they would in this setup, because they were set up out of a S&C law firm that dealt with this kind of international finance out of Manhattan there. And, I've known people who've worked at that law firm over the years. It's still incredibly secretive. But back then, as Allen Dulles, he's writing up the charter for the CIA right out of S&C, these people understood, how to move that power. And they understood that having that agency in there would help them control the government. So we have this problematic system of secrecy in there that includes the continuity of government program, the X-Protect UFO file group. So somewhere along the line in our government, there needs to be some efforts made. And the opening of this, kind of the caricature in a sense, or the D-class committees trying to get to the bottom of these old crimes, they can really explode the scene if they can expose the CIA's role and the reason, the why behind the Kennedy assassination. It's a crucial aspect of our history and we're going to get there. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. Okay, X Series 195. We're going to do about 5 more minutes of this, and we go to your questions.
Okay.
Fantastic. Okay, a couple of things to put on the record. That is the shot I love to show. If you're a regular in the ideas room, tell me who those two people are. That's what I want to hear. Well, one is giving the other one the award for the Career Intelligence Medal. One of them is deeply involved in the UFO file. The other one's deeply involved in the JFK assassination. This is the thing that should be front and center in that committee. And of course, it's Admiral Bob B. Inman, who's still alive, the former NSA director, who, as I said, bravely showed some openness about the UFO file at one point. I wonder if he'd be willing to tell this committee, through subpoena, under testimony, under oath, what they gave that award to Joannides for. It's crucial, and that's a question that I don't see Jefferson Morley asking, although he's rightfully put forward the Joannides question. Where are those 44 files? That's the absolute crucial aspect. And in the meantime, you know, the CIA is making waves with the Age of Disclosure movie, Dan Farah. Excuse me. As I mentioned, he's the agent of the counterintelligence. He's the press guy for the counterintelligence, his book agent and everything else. Counterintelligence agent Lou Elizondo. He's the director and producer of the movie. And so this is CIA's version of Disclosure. We are smothering in CIA operations around the UFO file in relation to Disclosure. And soon you'll be smothering in CIA Disclosure versions of, hey, we found this ancient stuff and this is how we changed the human origin story. So you're going to find these things go hand in glove. But right now, what they need to do is spin any of that history that's coming out. And you notice that the original buzz off of the JFK files does not feature heavily the Central Intelligence Agency, because you're not getting the records of the person who controlled and was Oswald's PSYOP handler, George Joannides. Those files are crucial, and we need a grassroots movement to remove those files from the Central Intelligence Agency to the public. Because if you don't get those files, it doesn't matter. The rest of the stuff is nice, but, you know, Joannides is the crucial piece. It's also the piece that they didn't count on us finding out. Okay, a little bit more. That's Bissell there. He's 6'8", so he's towering over Kennedy there. But we have the outgoing CIA director here, Alan Dulles, deeply involved in the UFO file, hand in glove with Richard Bissell, the mayor of Area 51. And over here, the incoming CIA director, McCone, who JFK called a real bastard. And he's the one that Kennedy goes, hey, give me those high threat cases. I want to share them with the Russians. Now, McCone, though, is kind of a, you know, banker guy, and he doesn't have the inside access on the CIA side. That is Guy Bannister, Lee Oswald's boss, in the summer of 1963. There he is mapping out sighting locations for different UFO sightings, because his job for the FBI, before he becomes a private eye in New Orleans running Oswald, is he's the chief UFO investigator for the FBI. I wanted to put this on the record because I think it gets missed. I've tried to point this out. I did an episode called The FBI and the UFO File. We have to get deep into this, which is the Central Intelligence Agency as one aspect of the UFO file, but the FBI has been a competitor, and we don't hear much about that. Until recently, something strange came up, and we found out that there was an FBI working group around UAP, it's UFOs. And all this stuff was set up by, of course, wonderful gentleman, J. Edgar Hoover, who really, you know, created the control files and ran a system where you could control presidents, generals, senators, you name it. And he was very much involved in the cover-up of the Kennedy assassination. But before that, it's very interesting because he was noting in memos in 1960, 3 years before Oswald, supposedly the alleged assassin of President Kennedy, which wasn't true at all. But he notes in his memos, somebody is, using his names. There's a double Oswald, and somebody's using his name to buy arms and things like that. So he's very aware of what's going on there. FBI Director Hoover claimed the FBI was not and never did investigate UFOs. This turned out to be a lie when a FOIA request was done and over 1,500 pages were released. Also was a strange relationship between the U.S. Air Force and the FBI. So now we know there are 2,400 files on the JFK assassination that the FBI magically found in relation to all this. So I think that there's some movement in the background there to try to spin it with certain files. But it's an important thing for us to keep in mind. The FBI is involved deeply in the UFO secrecy. One other thing I wanted to put on the record is there were a number of file releases along the way with the JFK files, but one of them was particularly important to understand as a pattern, which is that a lot of the people who were doing the covering up for the media were CIA assets or actual CIA agents in that era. So one of them here, former Miami Herald editor's ties to CIA confirmed, but still unclear in the latest JFK docs. I found about a dozen of these high-end editors who, if you look through the different documents, you're going to find they're all being controlled, basically, by the CIA, told what to say. So when Kennedy is assassinated, they need to get the Oswald story to stick. Instantly, people are not believing it, especially after Oswald is assassinated by by Ruby so quickly. And there's no trial, there's none of that. And there's the Warren Commission, you know, that whole operation, the cleanup committee, and people just aren't buying it. So these people, there has to be a brain trust of the media to cover this up. And now what we're finding out through the file releases is just how many of those editors and publishers were on the CIA payroll, agents of influence, and otherwise. That's very important because we need to understand why these people would lie. They're under instructions. And so, you know, we learned over time just how corrupt the media was, to the point now where, you know, the media has something like an 8% approval rating, and they've had to re-ingratiate themselves, as I said, into the independent space. So you're seeing this migration going on. But it is very important how we get our media and who is behind that as well. I think it's crucial. So as we build something of another track in relation to independent media, and I think there's going to be a third track here, because the corporate media was one thing, and then the independent media has been very, very corrupted and saturated with these different influences for confusion's sake. There's going to need to be a third version of this to get a true independent voice in the media, so you can get to the facts in relation to this. And with that, Miss Olivia, I'm turning it over to you. I have more to add.
There's tons already. Okay. Quad 57. Joannides was brought up in the hearing. Can you explain the takeaway?
Yeah, I mean, it's incredibly flat. I'll tell you what's weird. Now, it's been, you know, a little while since the files came out, but we still don't have the Joannides files. So the only thing that they got there was a recommendation from Morley, who, after all, was crucial to discovering that. And I have some of the original notes around Joannides. I'm going to read a couple of quick things. So the whole point about Joannides is that there's this group, the DRE, who's a revolutionary group the CIA is supporting, spending thousands of dollars every month on. And they're an anti-Castro group, and they're building them up, and they do all kinds of things. You know, they're building a militia, they're trying to create a propaganda wing, everything else. So they get paid to engage with Oswald and surveil him. And as soon as Oswald is grabbed for the shooting of Officer Tippit, not for the Kennedy assassination. Remember, Oswald is grabbed on a technicality for supposedly shooting Officer Tippit, even though he wasn't in the area. So they needed that first piece. And immediately, this DRE group starts running these advertisements saying, Oswald, he's a friend of Fidel Castro. He murdered Kennedy, and we need to invade immediately. They're the ones who are doing it, and it is Joannides who's setting them up to do it. So Joannides, as the top psychological warfare officer, is creating the Oswald legend, and he is creating the Oswald project here. So that they've hid his records, they've been sued in court now over 20 years to get those records, and they've never given those records up. They are absolutely crucial. The record suggested George Joannides was an SAS operative. The reason for his interest, the bulk of the available evidence indicates that Joannides in late 1963 was running a psychological warfare operation designed to link Oswald to the Castro government without disclosing the CIA's hand. Joannides is a new and important character in the Kennedy assassination story, the son of a well-known Greek-American newspaper columnist in New York City. He went to law school and joined the CIA in 1951, so he'd already been in the CIA for 12 years as a psychological warfare expert. Fluent in Greek and French, he was sent to the Athens station. By 1963, he was 40 years old, a rising protege of Tom Karamezanines, and he was highly regarded for his skills in political action, propaganda, psychological warfare operations, which is what he did against the American people by creating the Oswald legend. A dapper, witty man, Joannides presented himself publicly as a Defense Department lawyer. That was his cover. In fact, in 1963, he was Dick Helms's man in Miami. And of course, Helms is the person, the CIA director, who Nixon will pull aside and say, look, you know, when these things happen, there's going to be committees investigating this new information on Kennedy coming out. This is like 10 years after the assassination. He says, I want you to give me the details of how you guys were involved so I can cover for you. You know, so when they come out with the whole who shot JFK angle, you know, I've done a lot to protect you guys. I've done dirty tricks and everything else. So make sure I want those files. Give me the background on how you did this, basically. And it's very interesting because you hear on the tape that Helms knows that he's being recorded, and he says, I'm here to serve the president or whatever. And he never gives Nixon anything. So there's a lot of background there on Joannides, but fundamentally, the 44 files from Joannides are the CIA JFK assassination files. If we don't have them, we don't have the JFK assassination files, and the whole exercise has been a farce. So if you don't get the Joannides files, it's really, you know, a rigged game, and you didn't get anything. The Joannides files are crucial because they're going to show beyond a reasonable doubt that the CIA set up Oswald as the designated culprit, and then when you get into the why, you're going to be able to track back how they were using him. And when you track the CIA footprints through Guy Bannister, who is the FBI chief in Chicago, who went to New Orleans to run these operations of infiltrating student groups and communists and all the rest of it, super right-wing, and that Oswald is working for him, but that Bannister controlled the UFO file. It's an unmistakable. I mean, it doesn't matter if someone, you know, in that world of analysis, whether it's a congressperson or an author like Morley or whatever, you can't deny the fact that the UFO file is sitting in the middle of all this. It's undeniable. Bannister originated the UFO file, and Oswald worked for him. And then the person who comes out publicly and says, we know all about UFOs and who's flying them, gives the Career Intelligence Medal to Joannides. If this was a courtroom, you know, you would know these are undeniable facts. So there's a UFO file component in the JFK assassination. That's how you can explode the case. Yes.
Okay. David Termina. It seems highly likely that Joannides must have been working with Bissell since Oswald was in the U-2 program, which Bissell ran. Also, Bissell was overseeing MK Ultra, which they must have used on Lee Harvey Oswald. Martin K. O'Connor, what if Joannides was in charge of the Oswald file as part of his fake Soviet defection, which Oswald totally failed?
Well, Gottlieb, who's the chief instigator of the MK Ultra program, is also deeply interested and a student of the UFO file. The only thing I can say...
Where do you get that? I've never heard that before.
Yes. That's on record. And
how come we haven't done an episode on that yet?
Well, because there's not enough there. There's enough to tie it in with this, but there's not enough
to flesh it out.
Yeah. What you can say about Oswald is, starting at the age of 15, he was in the Civil Air Patrol, and that David Ferry was his commanding officer. Ferry, we know, deeply involved around the JFK assassination. But all of those people who come forward now and have been trying to spin the files, still to this day, the CIA's way, and say, oh no, Oswald was a lone nut and all the rest. Like Posner, who's been discredited how many times? It's ridiculous that he's even out there saying anything. And, once in a while, this is part of the problem with Morley, and just a minor criticism here, which is he's always doing, Posner's got this right or whatever. He's always trying to pretend that he's not, I'm not into conspiracy. God, don't think I'm a conspiracist. Look, it doesn't matter. The minute you go against the CIA grain, the whole media world is lost to you. So what's the point anyway? Get to the point of where the evidence takes you. And don't worry about what a discredited Posner case closed nonsense, But one of the things that they said was that, there's no proof that Ferry ever, knew Oswald. Well, he was in the same unit. And then they tried all these tricks to say it wasn't true. And then finally the picture came out, and what could they do? It just showed that they were completely wrong, because the picture showed them together in the Civil Air Patrol when he was 15. As the paperwork trail did, and witnesses and all the rest of it. So they just didn't want those answers. And so you had those bozos controlling the scene through television interviews and everything else. Now they're trying to take to the alternative media space and, we're debunking this and that. There's no CIA involvement. It was all Oswald. That's really, looks ridiculous. So now it's about, how deep can you go? It's not, were the CIA involved? See, this is the problem. You need to get past all those questions. The CIA was definitely involved in President Kennedy's murder. The question is, why did they do it? And then when you get to the why, you get to X-Protect and you get to the aerospace piece. That's how you can really shake the thing up. Otherwise, they're going to have you talking in circles about, Carlos Marcello. There's a movie coming out about Marcello killing Kennedy. I mean, this is how they're going to spin it. So it depends. Do you want the truth, or do you want to just have these endless circles? If you get to the truth, though, you're going to be looking at a paradigm shift, fundamental paradigm shift, because we're going to have people looking at it and saying, wait a minute. Why were they willing to sacrifice a president over the UFO file? That, you can see the earthquake that would be. Yes.
Okay, 3 together. Bartow, as Colonel Prouty says in The Secret Team, since its founding in 1947, the CIA has taken over every other agency of the United States government. Jumpjet, JFK was told the CIA was becoming a state within a state, e.g. 45% of the State Department operatives had CIA affiliation. Fern Folks wants to know, how are CIA and COG connected?
Well, these are secrecy networks, right? The other thing about, we put that quote on the record, actually, about Fletcher Prouty, because it's in the opening of his 1997 version of the Secret Team book. And we've included that in our documentaries and stuff. But I think what's important about it is he mentions that UFOs and aliens are being used as the new boogeyman. They're being prepped for this now. So he saw, what is that, 20 years ago, 25 years ago. Before he died. And this was a person who was the liaison between the CIA and the Joint Chiefs. He understood that they had removed President Kennedy, and he felt that his old boss, Edward Lansdale, was the key man involved. And it's interesting because what they used to do with Lansdale was send him into places like the Philippines or whatever and overthrow the leader and have him stand there with the new guy. And he would be the mastermind. He would set up how to overthrow the leaders. Well, Lansdale resigned from the Air Force in October 31st. And one of his last orders was to send Prouty to Antarctica so that he would be nowhere in sight to help with the setup of the security for the president. That's in, actually, the JFK movie and in other places. Absolutely crucial, pivotal little piece of information because Prouty instantly knew, as somebody who'd set up the security for the president's trip and Eisenhower's and stuff going into Mexico, that they never would have done the unusual things in the security stripping that they did for President Kennedy in Dealey Plaza so he could walk into that ambush. And he identified pictures, and a number of people in that military establishment identified pictures of this very unusual gentleman walking by the three tramps and the police and all that as Lansdale walking around there. So here he was in America doing the same thing that the CIA had sent him over to places like the Philippines to do, which is, oversee the overthrow and the installation of a new president in a coup. It has to be understood that way, and it doesn't, it's a bad reflection on America. And yet, the Central Intelligence Agency is still sitting on this perch of information and the public not getting the real answers, including the Joannides files and the answers on the UFO file. It's an absurd situation. So what I feel, and also there's a kind of an urgency around this because there's a lot of things that are going on in the background in relation to COG, the UFO threat, Earth changes, the knowledge of pole shift and things that are going on in the background, the things that they're studying that the public has no idea of. So I think the further away that we get from holding those groups accountable, like it's almost like it's slipping away, which is why it was so disappointing that the day after the hearings on JFK, where you would have expected, they got to the bottom of something and showed the CIA did this or that. Like we talked about earlier, the whole thing was about, hey, the journey of one researcher going from a skeptic to a believer, that the CIA was involved somehow, but maybe it was just negligence. It's not negligence. They planned it. Or they were an aspect of the planning through the deep state. But certainly the CIA is right in the heart of the Kennedy assassination. Anyone who studies it would have to come to the conclusion that they're involved in it. And so it's nice that, 20 years later, this guy gets on board. But come on, one of the best JFK CIA books is Mark Lane. It's from 1992. So, we need to move this whole thing in terms of history.
Can I say something? Yeah. I'm going to go for it. It's amazing, these 5-minute researchers.
Yeah.
When you think about the brains, the intellect of the people that have been researching the JFK assassination for years, since it happened in 63.
Oh,
you
yeah.
think about Mae Brussell, you think about all the authors and the
incredible
blood,
research.
sweat, and tears they put into it.
Yeah.
And yet these people literally, they have a very short attention span. They read something online. They go, oh, I know, I figured it all out.
Well,
it's just so aggravating.
Mark Twain agrees with you.
Uh-huh.
Mark Twain had a very interesting quote. It's actually in a Paris Flamand book. And I thought this really sums up the pop clickers and the 5-minute researchers. But he said, it's so interesting how they're just discovering things that we've known all along. And I think that's part of it. And I also remember this was part of the whole DeLong thing with UFOs. There's a UFO crash there in Roswell. They recovered a UFO. It's like, oh, this is supposed to be new stuff, right? Very strange when you get right down to it. And it's very interesting to me because even out of the people who've thrown in with the whole UFO thing of Elizondo, Mellon, and all those counterintelligence people, those people haven't produced anything. They haven't given you anything of substance. As a matter of fact, 7 years ago or whatever, the films that they put out had already been on YouTube since 2012 or whatever. So we're talking, they're not even giving you, the stuff that would be earth shattering or whatever. They're just talking about that movie, Age of Disclosure. They're like 34 talking heads from the intelligence community tell you. So yeah, they sit there and they spin a big story. 34 intelligence people. Big deal. Have they given you anything that's compelling? No. They haven't even broken into their archives. And this gets very strange because, the government has the greatest archive of all in terms of UFO sightings. They have space satellite footage, tons of it. And they've recovered craft and all the rest of it. But the private defense contractors like SpaceX, this is a very interesting anomaly in all this, of course, with Elon and everything else. But Elon knows all about that. But what does he do? He comes out and he says, oh, there's no such thing as UFOs. Wish I could see some proof of those UFOs. Well, how about looking at the largest repository of UFO images and videos outside of the U.S. government, which is SpaceX, and that's your company. Maybe they should let you see that stuff. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. X-Series 195, the JFK files, Blackout, UFO file, Hijack. Who did the hijack? Well, the CIA has been putting forward people to hijack the D-Class committee on the UFO side. And, on the JFK side, we weren't able to get any answers in that committee hearing, really, because either the people asking the questions were uninformed or they were trying to score political points. So I wonder if there's a way in that committee to say you have to use your 5 minutes to ask the question, in relation to the assassination. You can't go off and say, I don't like the fact that, President Trump uses a golf cart and use it as a political move there. Come on. There must be a way to compel them to actually stay on point or get penalized or something. Ask the question. And if you don't know anything about the JFK assassination, get off the panel. There's so many people who do. And I'm sure you can find some Congress people who know something about it. Yes.
It's an abomination.
It is. Oh, those were horrible. That was one of the... I felt bad for Luna and Burchett because they had the people on the Democrat side, when they brought them in, they wanted to talk about, U.S. aid and Trump's golf cart. Come on. This
I know
is
we waited so long to address this.
Yes.
Right? And that's
60
how they're going to
years.
spend the time.
Right.
It's an FU to the American public. It pisses me off.
There's no question.
All right. So, by the way, David Donaway says, quote, all you need in this life is ignorance and confidence. Then success is sure. That's a Mark Twain quote, which is great. So the Black Zionist says, I heard that NBC has a tape showing Oswald outside the school book depository on looking the JFK limo before the shooting on Houston Street. So what is the story with that?
Yeah, that is, it's called the Darnell film. Everyone's already seen it. So there's actually a version of it in the 6th floor museum at the Texas School Book Depository now. And supposedly NBC has a pristine version of it, and there's a figure in there they call Prayer Man who's standing next to Billy Lovelady, but his hands are up above so you can't really see his face. And I think when this came up that Luna was excited and she blurted this out, and then it became the headlines. There's this new film, but it's just the Darnell film, which all the JFK researchers knew. So again, it shows that they don't have the background in the committee. But instead of getting those types of headlines, you can, for example, if you had that hearing with Inman and Pippa Malmgren and Douglas Caddy, who's the Watergate lawyer, who, was a witness to the fact that Hunt told him was his best friend before he went to prison, and his lawyer, by the way, that Kennedy was assassinated over the UFO file because he was about to share our most vital national security secret, which was the UFO file. That, you see, would get you on a completely different trajectory. And that's the kind of thing you need in a committee like that. This thing about the NBC tape, is pretty flat. I'm sure there are films out there that haven't been released, but so far, they can't even get the Joannides files. So, I mean, that should be pretty easy. There's 44 files. The CIA has them. We know that he was involved in setting up Oswald. He was the top psychological warfare guy. Where are the files? How can you even say that it's any kind of a CIA release of the files without the Joannides file? So, and those researchers, there were researchers, like Morley did bring that up during the hearing. Yes.
News Drifter, DJ, isn't one of the most obvious signs of aerospace involvement is the fact that LBJ was in charge of NASA and concentrated so many of the top minds involved in Texas under his watch?
There's no question. And I'm trying to think of the name of the congressman who is giving him the wink on the plane. It's right on the tip of my tongue. But he controlled the other aerospace purse strings, and along with Senator Byrd. And, of course, Senator Byrd, Harry Byrd's cousin, owned the Texas School Book Depository. So this incredible confluence of influences there. LBJ is close to D.H. Byrd. D.H. Byrd owns the Texas School Book Depository where Oswald's working. But D.H. Byrd is the CEO of Ling Temco Vought, LTV, which is creating what? Experimental aerospace craft. And they become incredibly wealthy after the assassination. So I like to make this point that when Oswald is showing up for work for $1.25 an hour, stacking books at the Texas School Book Depository, he's punching in to a building and a job owned by a person who runs an experimental aerospace company. I mean, so everywhere you look, it's an aerospace interest in this case. That's just, that is the function of the case. The question is why, and then when you get into that, you're dealing with extreme experimental aerospace and the UFO file and the things that Kennedy was involved with there, like Blue Gemini and Dinosaur and those programs that constitute the early version of the secret space program, which were set up, according to people in the government like Corso and others, to surveil and even chase UFOs because they didn't know what they were. And they needed that information, and it had eluded them. And they had maybe some wreckage, they had video, they had accounts and all the rest of it. And they had this very unpredictable quality of science and physics that happened in relation to the UFOs, which is part of that's described there in the Malmgren story where he's holding it. He starts to hear voices in his head. There is an apotheum quality. We did a whole apotheum documentary. And if you're a regular on this program, watching it from the Ideas Room, you know all about apotheum. And I'll spell it for you. It's APOTHEUM. This is the quality that both the experimental X technology and the UFO file share in common. So that X technology with apotheum resides in the UFO file. This is what they study. And what it does is it distorts reality. It's a reality distortion field. And that's what happens. So when they had this major crash, if you go back to one of the really important crashes of Aztec, New Mexico, the real story is when they would send people in there, because it was intact, unlike the Roswell craft. They would send people in there, and within 20 minutes, they would be suffering delusions, seeing relatives who had passed away, getting physically ill. They couldn't have anyone work on the reconstructing or the redevelopment or investigation of these craft for more than 15 or 20 minutes without suffering these types of things. I remember, and I've brought up that when I was very young, like 17 or 18, I met John Mack because I knew his assistant. And Mack, one of the incredible things that he put across in his book and some of the conversations and things that I had with him was that people would get abducted, and they would get abducted through things. They would be taken out of cars, through the ceiling, out of walls. So you go through a wall, and the aliens are doing their whole research subject thing, but they've brought you through this other process. So how does that work?
Can I mention something
Yeah.
there? I was just...
That's apotheum, by the way.
Yeah, I was listening to an NDE and the person rose up over the ambulance that their body was in.
Ah.
And what was interesting is that he said the ambulance, he wasn't just on the top, like the ceiling of the ambulance, he was up above it, but it seemed like saran wrap. It was barely visible, like he said translucent, like saran wrap. And
so that's like astral
apotheum
projection.
right there. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. There's definitely some crossover with this. And just taking basic stuff, the Betty and Barney Hill case, the foundation of missing time, that they're going down the highway and boom, they show up 3 hours later. Time disappearing, your memories disappearing, and compasses not working, engines stopping, entire towns being blacked out, lightning showing up. When the craft land, nothing grows there. It's all apotheum effects because there's something in that field. And I think one of the things they tried to do in relation to the UFO file is aim that as part of the weapons redevelopment program. And I got that from kind of reading between the lines of the Sarbarker, that top physicist, and his quotes about that they had studied the UFO file, and he didn't know why that information didn't come out years later. There was something about it that I think they were worried when they used it, if they used it as a weapon, that there were aspects to it that could boomerang. It wasn't easy to control, but also the idea that, that reality distortion physics or even a kind of torsion physics would make the nuclear bomb look like a firecracker. This is why the UFO file was placed at the top thing right above nuclear security. It's the top secret at that point in the UFO, in the United States government and the national security state. But now, I imagine it's an even tighter secret. Yeah. Before you go any further, everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. X Series 195 is the JFK Files Blackout UFO file. Hijack, the CIA deeply involved in spinning this Luna committee on the UFO side. And unfortunately, as I said, the first version of the JFK iteration. I do think, by the way, Burchett and Luna could be, they could get some results if they went about it the right way. So if they had the right witnesses and if they just X'd the CIA people out and got rid of that whole narrative, then you could be looking at something very important. Yes.
William Acedo, does Palmer Luckey have access to X-Tech knowledge?
Well, I got to tell you, Lucky, who we've brought forward on this program when it came to the whole thing about the drone swarms and everything else, is a very interesting character. Of course, he sold his whole ocular VR thing to Facebook, and his early companies have weird titles like Illuminati Eyes and things like that, and whatever, right? But what happened to him is that he became instantly, coming out of that whole Facebook deal, he became such a hardcore military drone, superior drone. His company, Anduril, became right in the center of that whole thing. And it's now got the contract to be the support for the F-35. So, yeah, something major is going on there in relation to Lucky. And I believe it was his company in concert with Northcom that conducted all of the drone swarms. And they were real. They did happen. The mainstream media try to feed you the line that it was just people imagining it. And the independent media, not the brightest bulbs in the world, unfortunately, bought into that and said, oh, yeah, people are just mistaking planes for UFOs. No, sorry. There were drone swarms. There were drones sitting over people's houses in New Jersey. There was a drone over Judge Napolitano's house. Just sat there, There's tons of witnesses to that stuff. How can you whitewash it because you don't understand what the UFO file is, one, and you don't understand the drone technology has gone so far beyond anything that we know. One of the things I pointed out at the time, and it was not taken up in earnest by independent sources, which should have been, which is that whole period of time came on the heels of the Northcom commander conducting homeland synchronization trials. And the theme of the trials was drones versus UAP. So, UFOs versus their weird drone technology, their homegrown version of the UFO technology versus the real thing. Those were the tests. So, I don't know. What do you think of that? Don't you think that timing is remarkable? I think it's remarkable. And so, the Northcom commander is the COG commander. And what I've postulated is that they're looking for is a sky emergency, a sky event. Well, here's a weird thing. President Trump, when he was president-elect, said, I'm going to get to the bottom of this when I take office. And in the meantime, they were starting to fly them over Bedminster, which is his, kind of Mar-a-Lago East up there in New Jersey. And he said, I'm not going to visit there. That's major. It's very, whatever was going on, very, very serious. And here's what's amazing. When you take what Trump was doing there, suddenly you started to see him in these, caravans. And he'd be going along and there'd be these, on top of his car were these drone rockets ready to take down the drones that were coming in. So obviously he knew something strange was going on. And then when they get in office, they're like, we looked into it. It was some drone enthusiasts or whatever. Sorry, that's not a real answer. But they couldn't talk about it, whatever it was. But certainly, if it was a Northcom secret test to see how the public would react, they certainly got a lot of information to data mine there. Okay, we'll take 2 more questions, everyone, and then we're going to call it an evening
2 more
here.
questions.
It is fantastic to be here with you, and it's great to be going into this. Like I said, we're working now on 2 different documentaries. Been shooting for the last couple of weeks on these, and this week we did a lot of it. And that is part 2 of the Hacking Atlantis miniseries, and also JFK and the UFO File, a new documentary. This is coming out now soon. We'll have those for you. Make sure you're on that newsletter list. You'll find out about them first, and it's also the best way to keep in touch with everything. It's right there at darkjournalist.com, and it's free. Go for it.
Okay, Quad 57. Did the crowd on Elm Street ever hear a shot or shots from the book depository? And do you think Wallace got off a shot?
Yeah, I remember there are accounts of all these pigeons flying off the roof. So something was done. I think also they flashed rifles outside this 6th floor window, and there were prisoners across, because the jail is across from the building. So they were looking up there and they were like, we see 2 guys. We thought they were security because they were flashing rifles or whatever. And they just wanted something out there to be like, hey, but no, I don't think shots were fired from the 6th floor. I think that something had been done there in the building. Another interesting account by Sandra Stiles and Victoria Adams, as they ran down the stairs or whatever, is that when the shooting took place, the power in the building went out. And it's interesting because if you track back, you'll see that Marion Baker, when he goes in, this is very interesting. He tries to take the elevator up to the 6th floor, but the elevator's out of action.
I didn't know that was because electricity was off in the building. I just thought somebody had paused.
I know. Me too. That's what I thought.
Wow.
So they said in their side of the building anyway that the power had gone out. So that would tend to let you know something is going on in that building to allow anyone who is up there agitating to look like there's an assassin up there. Because there's no way that it was Oswald. Here's what's really interesting. And Oliver Stone brought it up. God bless him. But Sandra Stiles and Victoria Adams were on the 4th floor. They were looking out the window. When they heard the shots, they ran down the stairs. But according to the report of the Warren Commission, in order for Oswald to have done it, see, because they had to run from where they were all the way to the other end and then go down the stairs. So they would have bumped into a running Oswald who'd had to have been down there, because within 90 seconds he's on the second floor and the cop holds a gun on him and says, "Is he an employee?" And the general manager truly says, "Yeah, he's an employee." And they leave him because he's just hanging out on the sixth floor with a coat. Now, here's what's interesting. They mention that the crew boss of the two women, Sandra Stiles and Victoria Adams, this other woman, saw them. She was on the fourth floor. After they leave, she goes and she sees them running down the stairs. So she's even behind where they are, and she doesn't see Oswald. So there's literally no way Oswald was on the sixth floor. It's impossible. So we can just dismiss that. He was on the second floor, and then he left the building, and he didn't run out of the building. He casually left the building, and then went home and figured something is wrong here, put a gun in his belt, and went to meet somebody at the Texas Theater, where they grabbed him. And I think that they were supposed to eliminate him there, and it just didn't work out.
Do you want to go over what Jim Mars told you about the Texas Theater?
Well, there's a couple of very interesting things there. One is that originally, when they interviewed witnesses, the news people, that the witnesses actually were like, "Oh yeah, the cops dragged Oswald out of the back of the theater." And of course, all the reporters were like, "Well, no, they just took him out of the front." And they were like, "What? No, they grabbed the assassin. They just dragged him out the back." So there's this Oswald double at the theater that they drag out of the back of the building. There's further unusual things that happen, including the fact that there's someone who is coming into Dallas who is part of a military program, and he's on his own. And the plane that he's on is one of these private military planes that flies these guys around for different things. And it says, "We have to make a landing here." And it comes down in the Dallas area, and two people get on, a Cuban-looking guy in coveralls and someone who looks exactly like this guy we'll learn later, Lee Harvey Oswald. And they sit there and they don't say anything during the whole time. And then the plane gets redirected to Roswell. That's a real account by this person. It's one of the strange anomalies in the JFK case. Who is the Oswald double who gets in this plane that makes an unexpected landing by the Trinity River, right there, in Dallas, and picks up the Oswald clone and a Cuban and drops them off at Roswell along with this guy. And then this guy is really out of luck because he's like, I never got to make my stop because they did this. And he goes to the guy in Roswell, and he's like, the next flight doesn't leave out of here for 7 hours or whatever. So
right, he's just some schlep, right?
Yeah, exactly. And yet the whole thing is, he's got the cred of the military orders and everything else. And he's a real legitimate guy, but that's a weird story.
Man, is that weird.
Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. It's X Series 195, the JFK Files Blackout UFO file hijack. This is important because remember, there's two things going on here. There's the JFK declass with the Luna Burchett Committee, and then they're also in charge of this UFO committee. There's an RFK committee in the middle of all that, RFK Sr.'s assassination. They're supposed to run something of RFK and MLK together as well. But as I pointed out earlier, the CIA, the intelligence people on the UFO side have hijacked the Luna one for that. And so far with that first committee hearing, we're not getting very far. Although I will say this, as I mentioned, there's no shade on the people running the committee. I think Burchett and Luna want to get some truth on it. But what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to outfox them by going deeper than just the superficial aspects, and certainly forget about the headlines about, a second film or any of that junk. Go for the witnesses. Tie the UFO file aspect. Make it stick. The aerospace connection to the JFK assassination. Use Pippa Malmgren. Ask her if she wants to be a witness. Douglas Caddy, I'm sure he would do it. He's been on this program many times talking about it. He's a Watergate figure. He's a historical figure. These are the people. This is the clout that you need to show JFK was assassinated over the UFO file. It's undeniable. And Pippa's dad, Harold, he's the national security advisor, in the Kennedy White House. How are you going to get around that? So he stated publicly, he told me in private DMs, he shared with his daughter that JFK was briefed over these UFO incidents and that the UFO aspect was a major concern in his presidency. That's crucial because when they say, well, UFOs, and what, aliens killed JFK? See, that's the way to blow it off. No, we have secret technology and secret awareness around the UFO file. And Kennedy wanted to share that with the Russians. You see how that works? It's not that far flung, but it is highly secret, and it's been kept secret for 60 years. So you can get to the bottom of that case by using that intelligence link into the aerospace wing. If you leave it out, then you're missing half the picture. And you're going to miss incredible connections with it as well. If you have these people, at least give them their day in court. See what happens. See what kind of bells ring through those intelligence halls. I imagine you're going to get a huge major reaction, and it's going to send a shockwave through that entire system because that is the thing that they've been hiding at the heart of all this. And we study so much of that here on this program. Miss Olivia, your final couple of questions there.
Okay, David Sherman again. DJ, it dawned on me that the biggest players in the assassination who were active military were all Air Force. Lansdale, Cabell, CIA planners and Blue Book Master, and Curtis LeMay, who was awfully close with Arthur Collins, the guy who worked with Byrd and Berkner in Antarctica radio communications.
Well, it's really true. And I'm glad that you mentioned LeMay again here because not only does he come up in Harold Malmgren's narrative, but I've pointed out that one of the things that he wanted in relation to all this, and it's on the record, it's in an episode that we did, and this is a very important episode about the Melchizedek device. And what is the name of our favorite hippie cult leader who was involved with this?
Brother Sunburst.
Brother Sunburst. Those two episodes are loaded with information relating to this. But one of the very important little things there is that LeMay is asking someone who is a master, aerospace guy. He wants him to go into the Reich material. And he wants him to kind of back engineer it to show how do you take a UFO down. Now, it's very interesting because if you go back in the story, you'll find at the core with John Trump and the whole story about Nikola Tesla and what he's going in there for, that the FBI agents are instructing him, we want you to find information about a device that can take flying objects down at a distance. That is the Melchizedek device, and I call it the UFO killer, which is a device, not a person, but it's the neutralizer, and it's the way to take UFOs down. And it may have been used in Roswell, in fact. But basically it works like this. If you follow that trail, we've also seen it when you get later into the contactees like Adamski. Adamski has a wiretap on him from the FBI, and one of the things you can learn in FBI documents is that at a certain point he starts talking about the Melchizedek device and how it takes down these UFOs that he's observing, and that he knows the group who has it and they're experimenting with it and all the rest. So that device that they thought was with Tesla that they sent Trump in to get ends up with these scientists that Adamski knows. So then they go and interrogate Adamski, and Adamski's terrified. They're like, "We'll deport you back to Poland. Tell us who has it." And he says, "Oh yeah, I will. I was spying on them myself because those guys are anti-American." And he gives them a bunch of phony names, and they follow it up, and they realize that they've been duped. But I felt, after my own investigation into it, that the Melchizedek device had been placed on Brother Sunburst's farm. And I think this is why Brother Sunburst became so wealthy. And also he was untouchable. And he was a neighbor, next door neighbor to Star Wars President Reagan. So there's a big mystery in the heart of that story. But LeMay is there. And he's trying to use the same thing, the Reich Cloudbusters, to... he's trying to get these aerospace guys to create his own version of the Melchizedek device. So he's looking for that in 73. So we know the search for the Melchizedek device runs from when Tesla died, 1943, to 73, at least 30 years there. There's no proof that they ever found it. And the very strange things that have come forward to me from people who were associated with the Sunburst farm and with Brother Sunburst and the whole group. And the very unusual story of that is a number of them have sent me very interesting accounts of seeing this device. So that may be a story that explodes along the way here with all this. And I think it's very compelling because it would be very important to find out what it is that could take things down at a distance. And remember, the way you can imagine this is the FBI guys were going to Tesla and saying, look, basically, if somebody's sitting in Hawaii, they press a button and there's a craft flying over the UK and that thing goes down. It can take things down at a long distance. That's the device we're looking for. Now, it's interesting because the spin that came out was, hey, go in and find us information about the death ray that Tesla talked about publicly. But apparently, in John Trump's memory, and I have 12 hours of his final interviews, that's not what he says. What he says is they asked him about this Melchizedek device. He doesn't call it that, but it does. That's the name that gets adopted for it later. And some of that happens through the author of Autobiography of a Yogi because he calls Brother Sunburst Melchizedek. Everyone, you're watching the dark. Is that clear, everybody? You're watching the Dark Journalist show. And so obviously it's a loaded subject. And thank you, David, for the loaded question. We'll take one more magic question from Miss Olivia. Before we do, I want to remind you one more time, especially if you're new, go to darkjournalist.com, sign up for our newsletter. You're going to want to be on that newsletter list because we have incredible surprises for you, including guest appearances. The documentaries are coming out later this month and in May. Brand new, and this is going to blow your mind. The guests lineup that we have for you between now and June will blow your mind as well. It's all there in the newsletter. That's free. And you guys can also sign up for bonus content, audio files, all kinds of things right there at the Dark Journalist website. We've made that very affordable. Get behind the show, get behind the things that we do here on this program for you. And it's great to have so many of you here with us. Miss Olivia, your final question of the evening.
I'm going to throw it out to a comment. Yes is quoting Bill Hicks. Quote, I visited the Texas School Book Depository recently. I saw the most amazing thing. They left the windows on the 6th floor exactly like they were on 11/22/63. Oswald wasn't there.
Right, exactly.
And I'm going to throw this out also. AP says, DJ, I just had my first child. Congratulations.
Oh, wow.
And there's no way they're learning about JFK from anyone other than you, my friend. God bless.
Wow. Look, I think of President Kennedy as an incredible gift to humanity, who helped us avoid a nuclear war, who saved the world from nuclear conflagration, was an incredible statesman, so very well informed, so careful as a president, as a leader, and who had created such a legacy of peace in the world and also had us looking forward. There's an incredible quote from Gorbachev who said, and at the time it was 50 years It was the 50-year anniversary, and he said, you know, I've studied President Kennedy quite a bit, and we're still catching up to his vision. He had such an amazing vision for what America could be and what it was all about. And this group inside that sabotaged his presidency and really the direction of America needs to be outed 60 years later or not. And it's crucial to the period that we're in, because that understanding is going to help us to evolve the correct future for America and for the world. If we miss that, you know, if we're stuck with CIA disinformation stories, then we're left back in the arc of history. And that's not where we want to be. We want to be on the leading edge of history. And even a committee, you know, like I said, even this show as a lone outpost doing it, with our interaction, the ideas from, sends that ripple. We're moving in the right direction. But even that committee, if they were to take inspiration from some of the ideas that we're putting forward here, could make a tremendous difference in the world. So I admire President Kennedy for doing so much in such a short time and being the youngest president ever elected. He's an extraordinary person, and I think he really deserves his proper place in history, and also history and the people deserve to know who his assassins were and why they did it, and that threat that he was to that system. And I think it's become obvious intergenerationally, you know, and family, you know, this has now been great-grandparents, grandparents, parents down to children. It's a line, a lineage. And I think President Kennedy exemplified the kind of bravery and vision that we need for the future. So, you know, there's a lot there. And, you know, you could spend a whole life studying President Kennedy's work. Just an extraordinary individual. Yes. I've got a good quote from Professor Scott. I wanted to read about COG, which ties into this, and then we'll get to your last question. We've stretched out the questions here nicely.
Yes, we have.
You're very generous. Nicely done. All right. It's clear the Office of Emergency Preparedness, known from 1961 to 68 as the Office of Emergency Planning, and then the name changed to the National Program Office, and then to Project 908. This is one of the things they do with steganography, is change the names. Supplied a common denominator for key personnel in virtually all of the structural events I have discussed: the JFK assassination, Watergate, Iran-Contra, 9/11. This is a long way from establishing that the OEP itself, in addition to the individuals I've discussed, was involved in generating any of the deep events. But I believe that the alternative communications network housed first in the OEP and later as part of Project 908 played a significant role in the JFK assassination, Iran-Contra, and 9/11. This is easiest to show in the case of 9/11, where it is conceded now that the continuity of government COG plans of the Doomsday Project were implemented by Vice President Cheney on 9/11, apparently before the last of the 4 hijacked planes had even crashed. The 9/11 Commission were unable to locate the records of the key decisions taken by the Vice President that day, suggesting that they may have taken place on the secure phone in the tunnel leading to the presidential bunker, with such a high classification that the 9/11 Commission was never supplied the phone records. My guess is this was the COG network phone. This is the Doomsday Network communication device. It was also used, this special communications network, which was set up in the event of a nuclear war so these high officials could communicate with each other. It was used in the Kennedy assassination, and the person who used it was Winston Lawson, who was the Secret Service agent who set up the route in Dallas. You will look and find continuity of government players involved in each of the deep events. And in the Kennedy assassination, you've got COG players on the ground, and you have the aerospace players all around. So, these are the undeniable pieces. If you want to get to the truth in that case, this is where you need to go. And it is paradigm shifting. Make no mistake about it, because it shows that deep structure. And so there are, kind of risks in bringing it forward. And yet this is what, this is where you need to go if you're in the business of telling the truth. And if you're in the truth-telling business and you're not telling the truth, you get out of the business, right? Last question, Miss Olivia.
I have to ask this.
Yeah.
Because everyone asks it, which is Lancelot Lake. DJ, wouldn't the most damning evidence have been destroyed decades ago? How can we have justice when we know that they've tampered with evidence and they've destroyed files?
Because the arc of the evidence, the arc of the evidence, the weight of the evidence already shows intelligence involvement. Now, it's on record that they were aware of Oswald and that the, Jesus Angleton had a 200-page dossier on Oswald ready for him 2 weeks before the assassination. So, we've known this, but these things get confirmed over time. And the hope is that they can, one of the things that Angleton said, one of the notes that got out was that he hoped he could wait out the Warren Commission so he wouldn't have to give up any of the CIA secrets. And the way that they think about it, he also knew, he said, when you were hanging out there with Helms and when you were hanging out there with Dulles, you knew that they were going to hell. And then he said, this is what he said at the end of his life after he was thrown out of CIA and everything else. And he said, and I know that I'm going to see them there. So they know. They know. The question is, they were allowed this power and they did evil things with it. But what's very important is that groups like that are never allowed to get into power. Unfortunately, as far as I can tell, they had never left power. We get changing administrations and different shifting winds, and sometimes we get lucky, yes. But this is the nature of the problem. And with that, Miss Olivia, great questions and the ideas from tonight. I have to really salute you because you came through and you're really on the ball with this subject, which I appreciate. I can say this about the Dark Journalist Ideas Room, which is when you're in environments like X or, YouTube or Facebook, whatever it happens to be, there's nothing, you do not get the quality that you get here in the questions and in the interaction and everything else here. So I want to take a moment to thank all of you out there in the Ideas Room, because I feel better knowing that in the world we have this kind of brain trust among us, and that so many are dedicated to the idea of transparency and freedom. And I think that's a great guiding light in any kind of journalism. So thank you very much. And Miss Olivia, your Super Chat committee.
Okay, it's having a hard time loading.
Your
Give it a
D-class
minute. Okay,
committee.
Here we go. All right. I, Tally Ho, Jay Parsons, Quantum Paradox, Jessica Rodriguez, The Bikini Truther, Durbin Downey, Flip, Empire of Light, Fulcanelli, Thomas Ball, Happy Hermit 3D, Babar J. Provolone, Mike Brosnahan, Jenny Runco, John Matthews, Sherry Brown, and Jennifer Walters. Thank you so much for your generous super chats.
Wow, incredible. We really appreciate your support. To all our subscribers, thank you. It makes all the difference. And we couldn't do what we do if it weren't for you. So thank you. And we're dedicated to bringing you the best possible bang for your buck in relation to that and the important stories we'll bring forward to you. We will be back with you next week. Of course, this is one of the books that I recommend to everyone. It's now 30 years old, and yet there's so much deep information in there. Deep Politics and the Death of JFK. That is Peter Dale Scott, Professor Scott, who's such an inspiration. I've been reading since I was about 15. So I guess you can see where I get a lot of my train of thought. And of course, Jim Garrison's incredible On the Trail of the Assassins. And Garrison, who knew that the CIA was involved and had stood up against them and had faced death threats and all sorts of terrible things, including the fact that after he tried Clay Shaw, this is not often brought up, but they had him on a bribery charge, and they were like, oh, you know, he took all these bribes and all the rest of it. And it looked pretty bad until it was learned that the witness was coerced and all the rest of it. And then they hit him with all these cases and everything else. And it really ruined his life there for a while, going out on a limb. So, but eventually, when Oliver Stone made the movie, it's his incredible revenge. He even shows up and plays Earl Warren in the movie in the cameo. So you can't get better than that. Bravo, Jim Garrison. I want to mention this book, which is a great foundation book. And it's my old pal, Ken Thomas, who passed away recently. But he was a font of knowledge, and he tracked some individuals, including Guy Bannister, and he tracked them back to the Pacific Northwest and newspaper clippings and going to all these libraries and everything else, finding them standing there, you know, with these things that were mistaken for craft in the hunt for the flying saucers. And he was able to show that people like Fred Crispin and Bannister and others who were involved in the first UFO case, which was Maury Island. I mean, you could say Cape Girardeau and is earlier, but Maury Island's the first, you know, just previous to Roswell, about a month. That Crispin is involved there. These people are involved in the Maury Island UFO case, but then they show up in the JFK case. They show up in the Garrison investigation, and then Garrison knows Bannister and in fact worked under Bannister in the FBI, and Bannister was in charge of the UFO file. So Garrison knew about the UFO file. That's the kind of wonderful things that we get from Ken Thomas's work. And of course, he had a great writing partner, Jim Keith, who died prematurely. And those guys did a lot to move the ball down the field. I'm going to do some shout outs here before we depart, everyone. And a great Friday night it's been. Let's see what we've got here for you. James Hadaway. Antisocial. Dark Journalist University, says Catherine Harris. I like that. Wow. Tormina says, I've been reading it all week. Which book is that you've been reading all week? Let's see what else we got.
Can I ask this?
Good night, Barto. Yeah.
Barto was asking, Tesla was the first to use the term flying saucer in his 1906 patent. I hadn't heard that.
You know, it's interesting. Both Tesla and it is true that the term is used earlier. I didn't know it was Tesla who had it in his patent, but I know Worrell Keeley had a demonstration of a flying disc among, you know, this kind of afternoon group of flight enthusiasts who came there to see him and what he could do. And he had this incredible picture that we've reproduced from this magazine of the period. And it just shows him floating this, you know, kind of miniature flying saucer. So, yeah, the stuff was there and around, but that is fascinating. Can you imagine the frat house parties at DJ University? LOL, fabulous. Oh, Jennifer, I'm telling you, you wouldn't believe it. Let's see. David Termina, Pacific Northwest, the place where mystery airships were most active. Excellent point. Indeed. Indeed. I know Walter Bosley was out there earlier tonight, speaking of airships. Great to see you, Walter. DJ, no better info everywhere. Cece, thank you so much. I appreciate it. It's great to have you here with us. Who else you got? Happy Hermit. Catherine Harris. Best live on the interwebs. Thank you. Golden Girl, Alley Cat. Good night. All have a great weekend. Babar Provolone. There you go. It's the ultimate cheese name. Elsid Barrett. Best damn door gunner ever. There you go. Kerry Thomas. Scarlet Fire. They released 80,000 pages of Nothing Burger. Yeah, I mean, if you're not going to release the Joannides files, then you could consider the rest a Nothing Burger. I agree with that. Let's see who else we got here. Ron CryptoBits, Peter Dell Scott, bingo. Yes. Peter Dell, very active. We've had some great interviews with him, of course, which are available on this channel. I highly recommend them. And his work, it's very interesting because one of the things he wanted to do and he didn't get around to doing was a deep state book on the Lincoln assassination, showing the deep state in that period very early on, because he certainly tracks the deep state back to the Revolutionary War. So I hope he gets the opportunity to do that. And of course, we know that Dr. Farrell has just finished this incredible book on Lincoln. Let's see what else we got. And somebody mentioned Gigi Young. Gigi Young has some shows coming up. She just did a show for her subscribers, and she's another one who has some phenomenal content coming out. And of course, Gigi, always fascinating, incredible work, and her highly recommend her Mars series, and some of the videos, of course, that we've done on Rudolf Steiner and the Eighth Sphere with Gigi, just completely off the charts. Fantastic. Our good friend, Gigi Young.
Thomas Ball is suggesting GJU t-shirts, which is a great idea.
That's a great idea. Thanks, DJ and Olivia. Tim Houston, thank you, sir. That's great. What time is it in Australia, Tim? That's the question. So great to see everyone. DJ understands Venusian impulses. Absolutely. Adrian gets the quote there. Let's see. Well, Camelot shall live again. Go, Gigi. Go, Gigi. Yes. I think I missed it. There it is. Astara says it. Bingo. Wow. So great, everyone. Thank you so much. And Termina, those were great questions.
As always.
I know Kate is out there. It's great to see you. Bikini Truther. DJ and the gang makes the best Friday nights. Thank you. We have exciting mini-series episodes coming up for you. And we have a great X-Series episode next week, interviews, and I have a guest spot I'm going to tell everyone about, and you'll learn about it before anybody because you're on the newsletter list, right? Everyone, so great to see you. Have a great night, and remember that it says end broadcast, but
never really ends.
It never really ends. We'll see you all next week. And have a fantastic weekend. And, never let it be forgot. Once there was a Camelot, and there could be again, especially if you get guys like RFK Jr. out there trying to make it happen, and that spirit comes back to us. So hats off to RFK Jr. and all the great work that he's doing over there. And we will see you all next week.
God bless everybody.
Have a great night, everyone.